燃え上がれガンダム。
Hello and welcome to Weekly Suit Gundam, the special bonus podcast brought to you by the folks at the Weekly Stuff Podcast. I am Sean Chapman.
And I'm Jonathan Lack.
And we are here, once again, to talk about Mobile Suit Gundam. This time on the show, though, we're not talking about any of that newfangled anime stuff. We're going old school, baby. We're talking manga, because we're talking Mobile Suit Gundam, the Origin, the manga, written by Yoshikazu Yasuhiko, on the sort of adaptation of the original series into manga form, but with significant alterations and significant additions, many of those additions being then adapted into the OVA episodes that we already covered. But of course, it felt appropriate to wrap up our discussion of Mobile Suit Gundam: The Origin by going to the source and talking about the original manga, because it really, it's quite remarkable.
It's quite remarkable. It is... You know, this is a very special episode of Weekly Suit Gundam because this is our 50th episode. And I will admit, when we started talking about how we wanted to cover the Origin, and I was looking at our episode count and everything, part of why I wanted to split it into multiple episodes was the feeling of arriving at episode 50 with an episode about the Gundam The Origin manga I thought would feel special. Because I think, undeniably, the Yasuhiko manga of Gundam The Origin is one of the most special and singular things this franchise has ever produced.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. I will say, for my part, I'm kind of a weirdo in, I feel like, anime fandom, in that I read manga before I watched anime. I am someone who, when I was a kid, we were getting our first wave of official manga translations in the West, in America, through, well, maybe the second wave. The first wave was like early 90s stuff where like traditional comics publishers got it and did all the flipping and all the bad shit with that.
Yeah.
And that was bad. But like when Viz did their first Shonen Jump magazine, and we were starting to get the tankobon, but they would call them graphic novels, out at like Barnes and Noble and stuff. And so like I read Dragon Ball stuff before I watched Dragon Ball stuff. I had seen like Yu-Gi-Oh on TV, and then I got obsessed with the manga and really loved that. And I just, One Piece early on, I really fell in love with manga, and I've always had a real love for the art form. I've never read that many American comics. Nothing against the medium, just to be clear. It's just it's just not something that's in my area of expertise that much. But I've always loved reading manga, and I really have a soft spot for it as just a mode of expression. And I think Gundam The Origin is the best manga I've ever read. I think it is a real masterpiece of pretty much every aspect of the medium, written by someone, later in their life, later in their career, with a real mastery, going back to work that was foundational to them as a creative person, right? And treating it with sort of the weight of experience, but also a singular vision, because we talk about Gundam in auteur terms quite a bit with like Tomino, but no anime is made by one person. It's a lot of people working together. A manga, sometimes there's assistance and stuff. I actually don't think Yasuhiko did that. I think he did this all on his own, is what I was reading about, other than like maybe some inking. And so it's a very singular experience. And I just think, there is something, there are certain things I like that the anime does more. There's certain things where I think the manga does it better. But either way, there is something so special about seeing a version of Gundam this sort of unfiltered through a creative mind on the page like this. It's very, very special, and I'm really glad we're going to take at least this episode to talk about some of the finer points of it.
Yeah, and it's interesting because as you say, Jonathan, like I do think in my experience, it's pretty unusual in the Western fan base to start with manga, whereas like in Japan, it's pretty ubiquitous. Like whether you start with whatever, but like manga as a ubiquitous part of the culture, particularly for younger people. But yeah, like for me in manga, I grew up reading American comic books, because that's the stuff that my dad read. So I grew up reading superhero comics, and then getting into Dragon Ball and that stuff through anime. But I did read some manga when I was a kid. Like I read the original, like the pre-Duel Monsters Yu-Gi-Oh stuff, which is always fucking wild. And if people have never experienced it, you gotta read Murder Yu-Gi-Oh, because it's fucking crazy shit.
The best thing I have ever done on Twitter, you can go back and find these, are my threads where I did, it's one giant mega thread where I read through Yu-Gi-Oh! And I did a kill count, remember that, Sean? Of every person Yu-Gi-Oh! Murders. Yes. And it's a lot, there's a lot of murder in that series. There's a lot of murder.
Yeah, way more than you'd expect, because you'd expect 0, but there's a lot more than 1, you know? So I did read some manga growing up, but I definitely was much more on the American comic book side. But for the past, like, 4 or 5 years at this point, I started getting into reading manga in Japanese, because it is, I think, that and visual novels are the 2 easiest ways to practice reading Japanese, or like putting on Japanese subtitles on a video where people are speaking Japanese. Like that obviously also helps. But with manga, and I assume this would be the same thing, and I've heard from lots of people in like interviews of like creators for whom English is not their native language. There are lots of people who learned English primarily by reading American comic books, because being able to give context to language through images makes it much, much easier to read. So for the past 5 or 6 years, like I've kind of like rediscovered manga or something as a kind of personal thing. And I haven't talked about it much on our podcast, mostly because I read it at a relatively slow pace, and just like do a couple chapters at night kind of thing, other than like Kimetsu we talked about in the podcast and stuff. But yeah, so that's something that's fun, and Origin got to be that thing for me several weeks ago, or a month or 2 ago at this point, reading through the whole thing in Japanese. And yeah, it is amongst the best manga. Like it is that I've read. It is a like masterpiece of the art form, I think, particularly in the particulars of like paneling, page layout, the way that like the art works, and these kind of the core fundamentals of like visual art, whether you're talking about comic books or manga, right? It's the same, like 2 different words referring to the same fundamental thing. But that like very particular art form, it is such a pleasure to read something like this that really understands the bare fundamentals of how to construct a narrative and pace a narrative and tell a story through the visuals as like the primary medium that is delivered. And there's obviously dialogue there, and the dialogue is good. I mean, the Japanese dialogue, I can tell you, is if it's a scene that was in the anime, it is the dialogue from the anime word for word, like with very rare exceptions. If it's adapting a scene from the anime, it will almost never change the dialogue. But it is the story and the way it's told through the visuals and through the art, and the way that the art is constructed, contrasted, and juxtaposed on between panels and pages, which is the core fundamental of what comic book storytelling is. And this is like a masterpiece of that art form. Like I do have quibbles, and we'll have like discussions about some of the things it does as an adaptation. There's some things it does that I kind of disagree with. And I do think ultimately I wish that the manga went further afield from the anime, because I think as it goes on, I think there's a tension in the work between things that Yasuhiko wants to do that's different, and then things that he's pulling in directly from the anime. And I think there's sometimes where I kind of wish you got more of him being able to go, or like feeling like more free to go further afield and just say, we don't have to adapt this like iconic scene from the anime just because it's an iconic scene from the anime, like then doing something more different with it. But that's more like partially a Gundam fan perspective coming from the show, and it's more of like the bigger picture. I have some issues with some storytelling choices, but the like core foundation of it is so sublime and so perfect in how it uses its medium to tell its story. And that's the thing that like I think is basically impeccable about Gundam the Origin as a manga.
I mean, if the collected volumes that we have in the U.S. are these, it's the perfect like versions that they got in Japan, so it's 12 volumes instead of the 24, and they're on like art paper, and they're big and really nice. But they also have all these extras, and basically every single volume has one or more essays from a various like manga creator or anime figure or someone. Like Makoto Shinkai comes in and talks, and Hideaki Anno talks, and then several like various like mangaka come in and talk, and you can just tell that throughout its serialization, this manga was just sort of greeted with awe by the industry of a lot of people who like know their stuff, looking at it and going, God damn it, this thing is crazy, kind of like I feel like, I don't know, like if you follow any like filmmakers on Twitter, the way they talk about Steven Spielberg's West Side Story right now, something where it's like, God damn it, this guy is really good at what he does, but like really impressed, and there's just a lot of that throughout here. But yeah, I really love Yasuhiko's artwork. Obviously, we both do, because we've said several times, that's sort of our favorite character designs in Gundam is first Gundam stuff. We really love the art style of F91, which he had a very big hand in, obviously. And, you get that in manga form where it's, just, there's no layer of someone else interpreting those drawings, right? It's all him. And I think that the two, like, number one things this manga and his talent has going for it is just the general sense of like paneling and how good that is that you talked about, Sean, but also how much nuance and detail he puts into character expressions, and that the Gundam character designs in facial features are fundamentally very simple, but he is able to wring out just incredible emotion from them. Like, this manga contains the best collection of Char shit-eating grins you will ever see. He is so good at drawing Char, you can just hear Shuichi Ikeda coming out of the page because he evokes that so perfectly. But also like with Amuro, and Amuro being very slightly redesigned, I would say, for the manga version. Just a really powerful version of that character, and all of them. Bright is very, very funny in this manga. I think he pulls on that Bright has always been he's been many things, but Bright is a little bit of a comic relief character in some ways in classic Gundam, because of how fucking beleaguered that guy is, and they really play on that in the manga, and it's very fun. The way he does color pages is just completely unlike most manga. Most manga, when they do their fun color spread, maybe like the cover page color spread will be something the mangaka did the coloring on and it looks really beautiful. But oftentimes if it's a color chapter, it's, just kind of fill in the color spaces, right? And it's not that interesting, I don't think. For Yasuhiko, the color pages are picked very intentionally. It doesn't feel like he was that limited in when he wanted to use them. And they're basically all done in watercolor. And they're very impressionistic. They are not like trying to be realistic color matches for what's going on, or even to like match what was in the anime. And it's just constant, breathtaking images that belong in a fucking museum. If you followed me on Twitter while I was reading the manga, I just took hundreds of pictures out of the manga, and I posted a lot of those on Twitter to share them. And I thought I was being a little indulgent at first, and it actually got a lot of reaction from people who were like, had not read the manga or hadn't been able to afford all of these expensive books, and were just very happy to see, like, this is the scene where Miharu dies. Oh my god, this is drawn really stunningly,
Yeah, and the version I read, so to also like reiterate, because you read obviously the English versions that exist over here as what in Japan is called the Aizoban, which is basically I love it. It uses the character love for it, which I love about that word in Japanese. It basically means like collector's edition, but it's like a fan's edition or something like that for people who love the thing kind of edition. But unfortunately, those don't exist digitally in Japanese, and obviously like as expensive as it is to buy all the English versions of the Origin, it would be substantially more expensive to buy all the Japanese versions of the Aizoban and then import them. So I read digital versions of the Tankobon, which are the like 24 volume original Japanese releases in like original in collected format. And those do have colored pages, but not all of the pages are colored. So some of the colored pages are instead rendered in like kind of grayscale. And one of the things though I do love about the way the coloring works because of the water paints or like the watercolor stuff is with a couple of exceptions, generally speaking, even translated to color scale or to grayscale, the variety and like the richness and the depth of the tones used with the color pages like render those images in black and white really gorgeously, and it has a different feel to it. But even a lot of those color pages, like converted to black and white, have this like very moody atmosphere that's like very rich and thick because of the nature of like the watercolor style that is used with the coloring. So it was never something where I felt like robbed or something that I was getting those pages in black and white, because they have it has its own like charm to it in a way that when I've read other manga, that because that's a pretty typical thing if you're getting a tankobon, they're not going to use like expensive paper stock and do all the different color pages, but usually like I feel like when that stuff is rendered in grayscale, it just looks awkward and bad. In the Origin, I never really felt that way, with the exception there were like one or two pages where it clearly like didn't quite work because of the exact colors that were used, but in general like it still looked really like gorgeous and really rich visually in black and white also.
Yeah, the it doesn't make as much sense in America where books are so expensive, but you know, if you don't know, tankobon in Japan are very cheap. They're like 350 to 400 yen, so they're like $4. You buy them at bookstores, but sometimes you also pick them up at like, you know, the convenience store and stuff like that. And you know, so like them being a little smaller and having the black and white pages, it's totally expected, you know, because you're paying so little for it. But yeah, so the perfect editions are expensive, but you know, they're still in print in the US and they're very worthwhile, I will say. You know, one of the nice things also about reading these in English is that this is a much better translation of Gundam than you will generally get from subtitles, because I feel like someone got to go through it with a fine comb and spend time on it, you know. And I generally think it's a very good translation. So if you're reading in English, they're good. I literally put Sean part of one of the stimulus checks we got here in the US. Most of those stimulus checks went into my savings and then went to help pay for like actual things I need in life. But I did put aside about $200, and that's what bought me the manga, and I do not regret it. That was a good little gift for myself, because these are treasured volumes, I would say.
Yeah, I mean, hey, you art is one of the things you need to get through life also, so I think that is a fair enough expenditure using a stimulus package. Because I probably, because I, like you, I put most of that money in my savings account. I'm pretty sure I bought a couple of video games with it, though. It's like, I gotta have fun too, baby.
Yeah, exactly. Hey, it was our patriotic duty, Sean. They weren't called hoarding checks. They were called stimulus checks. Exactly. If I want to spend $200 at rightstuff.com buying manga, I can. I'm supporting a small business, sort of.
There you go.
Yeah. Anyway, but yeah, it's, you know, overall, if you are not going to stick around for the overall conversation and just kind of want to hear sort of our broad spoiler-free thoughts, I cannot, if you have any affection for Gundam at all, you will love this manga. That is the easiest guarantee I think I could ever make in the world. You know, I think everyone will have different points of comparison of like which version they like best and all of this stuff. You know, I would say my two favorite Gundam things are Mobile Suit Gundam, the TV show from 1979, and Gundam the Origin, the manga. And those are sort of the tippity top of my pyramid. And I love a lot of other Gundam stuff, but those are sort of, like I said, the top of my personal pyramid.
Yeah, and for me with this, honestly, it's almost like the Gundam stuff is kind of like almost like a side for it with it for me, of like it is like more about just like the craftsmanship of the of the piece itself, of it being a manga, because it really is like. Because I almost feel sometimes the Gundam stuff and the way the TV show relates to the manga is mostly where I have like elements of contention with it. Where I almost feel if you didn't ever watch the TV show and you just read the manga, that I think there are things in there that bothered me that wouldn't bother you. And the nature of like the craftsmanship of it, and that's I think kind of like what we mean when we say masterpiece is it's about the fundamental craftsmanship of the art form that it's a part of. And it really is just like basically like a whole like university course or whatever, just on paneling, or just on facial expressions, or just on pages and pacing. Like it is like a master class on how to do visual, like sequential visual storytelling in comic book or manga form. And that's the stuff to me that like is the biggest pleasure about Gundam the Origin, is because I think it is a art form that is like oftentimes hard to see executed at this level, because in the West it's very niche And in Japan, it's almost too popular for that, because it ends up being produced in this like factory-like way, where it's like, you know, most mangas like gets a new volume or issue like or chapter every single week and published in Weekly Shonen Jump or stuff like that. And it's like it comes out too fast that it doesn't get the love and attention it like fully needs. And so I feel like this is an art form that oftentimes is hard to find stuff that is that like upper tier. Like this is just truly a masterpiece of the form. And Origin is definitely in that sphere for me, with stuff like Watchmen or Mouse, or in manga form, the other manga I would point to that I've read would be Akira by Katsuhiro Otomo, which is probably the most impressive like visual storytelling piece I've seen, in a way that I don't understand how the dude fucking drew it. But like it's that kind of stuff. This is in that category of like this is the top tier like real deal shit. So if you're someone who has any interest in just like manga or comic books in general and likes the art form, like this is something you would like really owe yourself to read.
Yeah, and I think that's what's so special. It's that, and it is the collision with, because I do not think I have the problems that you're gonna outline today, Sean, and that's fine. We can think differently. But whether you do or not, yeah, it is that collision of like, I think if you're a Gundam fan, I do think seeing seeing images of like the Red Zaku done with this level of mastery is some of where the just humbling aspect of like, oh man, this is a fucking thing I'm looking at, right? Yeah, it's a super impressive thing. We've gushed about it for 20 minutes. Sean, you have read this much more recently than I have. I am very busy, and I did not have time to go back and read this whole manga. Because one thing to say is, it's not that long a manga. It's long, 24 volumes. I've read much longer manga. I've read One Piece. We're at over 100 now. But this is 1/4 of One Piece. But I will say this takes me longer to read than any manga I've ever read, because the art is so good and you just want to be in it, and it is very it's what was the term you used? There's like compressed, obviously, where you'd like put a lot of action.
Decompressed.
It's decompressed. It's very decompressed. Well, we can talk about that more later. So I did not have time to go back and like reread this whole manga, because it would have taken me. It took me like a whole summer to read. It's a very in-depth endeavor. So I will kind of let you guide the conversation. What kinds of things do you want to break down as we talk about Gundam: The Origin?
Well, I think actually let's start with some of like the compressed, decompressed, and like kind of the stylistic stuff about it that I think is really remarkable. Because so obviously like a big part about the Origin that's fascinating is that it is a comicalization. I have recently learned that there is a word in Japanese called comicalize, which is used to refer to something that has been turned into a manga. Which is like hilarious, because it's such a good English word that doesn't exist in English. But someone came up with a fake English word in Japanese, and it's like, why don't we have that word? It's because comic books aren't as popular. But it's a thing
word they need in Japan, because if you don't know, like most of these never get translated or released officially. But like if an anime wasn't based on a manga, it's probably getting a manga adaptation. And frankly, even if it was based on a manga, it might still be getting a manga adaptation. Like, they're just very, very... Like, Dragon Ball has, like, Dragon Ball SD that's just retelling Dragon Ball with, like, the super deformed chibi characters. No one needs that, but it's out there. It's the comicalization is everywhere in Japan.
Yeah, it is. Because manga is such a kind of a ubiquitous entertainment form that, yes, like any anime, any video game, any light novel, anything like that that's in that kind of sphere of popular culture, if it doesn't already have a manga, it will get a manga. And as you said, even if it does already have a manga, it will somehow get another one. So, it's a pretty common thing. I mean, it's for most Gundam series have mangas. I mean, the original Mobile Suit Gundam didn't for a long time, mostly because it was from an era before that was a common thing, because that mostly started happening in the 90s. Although now you can go back and there's like a Zeta Gundam manga and stuff like that. I think there's actually multiple at this point. But most other Gundam series do have manga adaptations. But this is like a pretty unique project, though, in that regard, because it is going back to a classic series that was an original anime project. It was never based on a manga. And then having someone, Yoshikazu Yasuhiko, who was a character designer and animation director on the original show, like reapproaching it. And so, like, as an adaptation, I think it's really fascinating. And obviously, I have some conflicting thoughts on it as an adaptation, because there are some things I don't love about it as an adaptation. that I kind of wish it went further afield. But there's other stuff about it as an adaptation that I think is absolutely incredible. Because there's sort of the two parts of the manga, right? There is we are recreating sequences from the anime in manga form, and then there's we're either changing something enough that it's effectively a different scene, or we're adding in a whole new scene. And with like the most notable section of that being the giant middle section of the manga that is all the flashback material that is covered in the OVAs. And so obviously we're not going to go into like the plot and discuss all that with that, because we already talked about that in the OVA episodes. But that's kind of the two different things that the manga is constructed out of. And one of the interesting things about talking about the style of it and like formally how it's constructed, I think, is in how it adapts so directly sequences from the anime into manga that I have never seen something so perfect in that regard, of taking something that exists in one medium, translating it to another medium, and like exactly replicating the qualities of it in that other medium. And that comes down to stylistically what Yasuhiko does, which is he goes for a heavily decompressed style of storytelling. And I talked about this briefly in one of the episodes of the Origin of the OVAs, but to go over it again briefly, the concept is you either have compressed or decompressed storytelling in comic book format. Compressed storytelling, which is what a lot of older comic books in manga more go for, is when you have like lots of action and lots of time represented by a fewer number of images, right? So you might have like, you know, one image that is like, you know, 3 big panels on a page, and each panel represents like, if it was super heavily compressed, like 3 different times in the day. Like the top panel on the page is the morning, the middle panel is the afternoon, and the bottom panel is the night. And that would be like a heavily super compressed version of comic book storytelling, where there's massive amounts of time and things happening in between the different panels. Most comic book storytelling has moved towards more and more decompressed formats as time has gone on. But Origin is extreme even in that regard. So decompressed is having more panels describing smaller moments of action. So in the Origin manga, what that is used for is often to replicate the kind of pacing that you accomplish using editing in the anime version, but recreating that pacing using paneling and decompressed comic book art in the manga. And so you will have scenes that are just like, I mean, image by image, almost exactly the same shots that the anime uses. But it's not just, you can't just sort of use the same shots and have a storyboard. It's like, how do you use the size of the panels and where the panels are on the page to lead the eye in such a way to create a sense of pacing, of different moments that readers land on and spend time on those moments that create the same kind of pacing that the editing in the anime does. And that's the thing that, like, I've never seen something else do that. Partially because it's like, this is like a really unique project, but also because it just requires such talent to get all that little like nuance that exists in the animation with like the characters' movements and the expressions on their face, and then like the juxtaposition of different shots. If they're having like, you know, a conversation between Amuro and Bright, and you're getting different close-ups on both of those characters. Dedicating multiple panels for like the faces for Amuro in like this conversation with Bright, let's say, and then you're getting multiple panels for the faces for Bright's face in response to Amuro, and it's not just here's an Amuro panel and we have all of Amuro's dialogue. Here is a Bright panel and we have all of Bright's dialogue. Here's an Amuro panel and we have all the response. Instead, you're tracking through individual panels all the nuance and the emotion that Amuro is feeling and expressing artistically, and the size of those panels shifts appropriately based on how significant that like emotional state Amuro is having is. And that mastery of the pacing and being able to take a sequence that exists in the anime and being able to read it in manga form and effectively in my brain feel like I just watched that sequence be animated, I've never seen something be able to like accomplish an effect like that.
It's really fascinating. You know, if anime fans who listen to this podcast want a good counterexample of like what's a very compressed manga, the best example of that is One Piece. One Piece, Oda's style is the most heavily compressed thing you'll ever see. He is someone who doesn't really draw fight sequences so much as he draws fight moments, and that like one panel will suggest a whole series of choreographies. It's part of why the One Piece anime moves too slowly by any standards. They have to do one of those every single week. There's only so much they can do. They should do half as many episodes as they do. It would be a better anime, but it is not as egregious as you would think, knowing One Piece basically does one chapter an episode. That sounds unbearable. Sometimes it is. Most of the time, though, it's not as bad as it would sound because those chapters are, like, Oda's action is so compressed that there are often scenes I read in the manga and I go, oh, this panel is going to be 5 minutes of the anime, justifiably so, because of what he's drawing here, because he's compressing that action so much. And so, like, it's some compressed in the manga, so the anime kind of has to uncompress it to make it work in film language, right? Gundam is the opposite, because Tomino's style as a director in Gundam shows is very compressed for film language, right?
Yes.
We've talked about this a lot. And Tomino evolves this over time very radically until you get to G-Reco, right? Which is just, shaved down to the edge of a knife in terms of its pacing, right?
Yeah, it's like so compressed by the time you get to G-Reco that it alienates most viewers that haven't learned the language to be able to understand how much information is packed into every single moment in G-Reco.
Exactly. It's almost its own version of film language at a certain point. But if you go back to OG Gundam, we've talked about this many times, the miracle of the first 2 episodes of OG Gundam. A lot of other Gundam shows do a similar plot to episodes 1 and 2 of Gundam, but they take 5 episodes, because of how much is packed in there. I mean, even some other Tomino shows, he has trouble getting, like, through that much plot that fast. And it doesn't necessarily feel unnatural, but it does feel different from other anime of that or any other time period. So, and I think Yasuhiko is very smart, and it probably just comes from, like, fucking, being there at the storyboarding level of that original show, right? And knowing all of it, that he has the right instinct of the way to recreate Tomino's pace on the page is not to try to do a fast-paced manga. You actually kind of have to do the opposite. So the first 2 episodes of Gundam become over 200 pages of manga. It's a huge stretch. It's way more than, like, the raw storyboards would have been or something, right? It's a very different thing.
Critically, that's one of the sections that has some of the fewest alterations in the entire manga. Like, there's a little bit of extra stuff at the beginning, and they, like, there's, like, more Gundams, or, like, I mean, those Gundams always existed in the anime. You just never saw them, because there was more than one, and they get destroyed. So it's like, you get a little bit of that. But the vast majority of what constitutes the first 2 episodes of the anime adapted into manga is some of the most faithful stuff, like, page to page, that you get in the entire manga. And it's still, as you're saying, it's like, this is 200 fucking pages. Like, it is a massive amount of manga time dedicated to that time in the anime. Whereas, like, normally that would be like in another manga adapting to an anime, that amount of manga would be like an entire core of an anime. That'd be like a fucking season, basically, Yeah,
it could be, totally. 200 pages, there's probably the Demon Slayer movie is maybe 300 pages of manga, less than that, and that's a 2-hour movie. It's and Gotoge is sort of more in the middle in his approach. It's not sort of extreme on either end. But yeah, it's like my favorite example in the Gundam the Origin manga, Sean, isn't the beginning. It's actually the Miharu plot in Dublin and all of that, which is maybe the closest thing in the entire manga to the anime. It makes no changes because how could you? The one thing it cuts is the one thing it shouldn't cut, which is Amuro giving him the toolbox. And just nobody gets that's the best moment. The movies don't do it. This doesn't do it. The toolbox needs to be there, but that's another discussion. And that's like well over 200 pages. That's like 250 pages. It's a big stretch of the manga to do what's a pretty little section of the story, but it does it just so beautifully. You just feel all of it. And I think that's exactly, Sean, when you're talking about it's translating the language of film, of anime, and specifically Tomino anime, which is its own kind of film linguistic construct, to the language of manga, with the goal of making it as effective in a manga as it is as an anime. And the way to do that is through this decompression, and it is very virtuosic.
Yeah, and it's something that I think, like, it's very easy to almost, like, miss how impressive it is, because it's that kind of thing where, like, it comes across completely effortlessly. Yes. And so I think it's, like, it's very easy to almost, like, dismiss it, because it's like, oh, well, all he's doing is taking this scene in the anime and putting it into manga. It's like, if you've never read another thing that is like both a manga and an anime, and you like can compare and contrast whichever direction it's come in, like you never get that. Like that's phenomenally difficult to do, or if like not like nearly impossible. Because again, I've never seen it done like this, and it's something that's like it's easy to dismiss, but in practice, it's virtuosic. It's masterful. Like it's an incredible mastery of the craft of manga and paneling and page pacing. Like I think but probably my favorite example, I know this is one that you also tweeted about, is the coming home section, which is our favorite episode basically of the original Mobile Suit Gundam. This is the episode where he goes and meets his mom, and then at the end of that, the white base leaves and the mom's on the beach, and all that kind of stuff. And it's very exactly that sequence as it was done in the anime. But using the panels and the size of panels and like the increasing size of panels as the sequence goes on, that creates the exact same feeling of pacing, even though it's like it's the same shots. It's again identical dialogue. This is part of like the almost surreal quality of reading it in Japanese, is because it is word for word the exact dialogue. You feel like you're just somehow watching the anime, just like perfectly replicated in these still images. And that's the kind of stuff that, looking at it, I'm just like always in awe of it, because it replicates the feeling I have watching that scene in the anime, just giving it to me in manga form, with some of the benefits that the manga format has, which is, I think so that you described, Jonathan, is where you're kind of like luxuriating in the art. Like you're spending so much time on it, even when it's a lot like sequences like that one where there's very little dialogue, you're still spending so much time, because I think this is how I read comics. I imagine this is how most people do. In a moment like that, you almost like kind of go back and reread it multiple times, or go through the panels multiple times in sequence, because it's very easy to do that in reading a book or reading a manga. And the art feels like it's kind of asking you to do that. It's not just about sitting there and staring at one panel forever. It's about enjoying the movement between the panels and the way that that's constructed. And it's so rich, and there's so much going on there with the mood and the tone and the style, that just going through that sequence multiple times and going back 2 pages and then going through it again and just appreciating the images and enjoying that sort of the juxtaposition and all of that, is like one of like I think like the distinctest pleasures, and my favorite part of reading the Origin is that level of like mastery of construction, and how good the art is on that level is just perfect.
Oh, totally. This is part of what took me so long to read the damn manga, is I would go through a scene at a normal pace, and then I would go back and look at images and juxtapositions, and I would take photos with my phone, just to save that picture, or I would tweet it out or something, just to like show the world, like, I need to share this image with you because it's so beautiful. Really, really, which I don't usually do while reading manga, I should say. Like, sometimes when I'm reading manga digitally, I will do that because it's very easy to take a screenshot, and I will like save. I have a bunch of Kimetsu images for that reason. But, when I'm reading a physical book, you have to pull out your phone and like your camera and do that, and it's kind of a lot. But I was moved to do it with this because it is so beautiful, and it's not just that individual images are beautiful, but it's the interplay between them, obviously. So, yeah, that coming home one is a good one, because it's like at least like 8 pages for not the scene, but like the moment when Amuro is walking away with Bright and his mother, kneels in the sand and goes, Amuro, like that thing. That's incredible.
Yeah, and it's where it's like you can just, if you've seen the TV show, you could basically hear the track that plays in that scene in the anime. Like you can feel everything that like the anime uses. It's all of its tools that it has that manga doesn't have to accentuate that sequence. And then Yasuhiko uses like equivalent tools to like suggest and invoke the same emotional state and the same meaning of like this very tragic but necessary departure. It's like it is, and the manga is like stock full of that. Like that's, I think, for me the easiest example to go to, just because it's like one of my favorite moments in the anime, and it's true of like many of these kinds of things in the manga, where you get the sad Gundam episode ending replicated in manga form, and it's like those are some of the most distinct and kind of like profound or powerful moments from the original show, and then seeing them replicated in manga form is like incredible.
Yeah, they're all over the place. The moment where Amuro and Lalah meet, and the swan, that is, there's at a certain point in the manga, certainly in the back half after the flashback, once I really was tuned to his style, I would just start getting very excited for certain scenes, and then you would see them, and it's like, yep, he did that justice. Oh my god! And he does all of them justice. There's no scene he does wrong. It's really incredible. Did you ever? Because I did this all the time. Did you ever just turn on Gundam music while reading?
Not while reading, but I would what I would frequently do is like go and watch like clips of the anime, or like it got me in the mood of where like on like my walks or something I would start listening to Gundam music.
Yeah.
But the thought didn't even occur to me. I don't think I've ever listened to music while reading a comic book before.
I started doing it when I would read Gundam Thunderbolt, the manga, because all of the stuff that Thunderbolt the anime does with music is pulled from things the manga suggests. So I would listen to like some of the jazz they invented while reading Thunderbolt, and it was very fun. And at a certain point, I had that feeling so strongly, Sean, of like I could hear the music in my head, that I just went, well, it's all instrumental. This is fine. And I would just turn on various pieces of Gundam music while reading, and it was a very nice way to do it. Not necessary or anything, but it's just how my brain was working.
That's very good. If I ever reread the Origin manga, I'll keep that at the back of my head. Just wait until there's a very good Char moment, and then put on the Sha song and just play that on loop.
Sha, 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 da, 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 da. Yeah, it's very good. Anyway, because my favorite thing about the manga probably is how he draws Char. I mean, he just like there is no panel where he skimps on the amount of regalia that guy has on, or like the amount of detail in his face. It's just, there's so many, when you talk about the decompression, there's so many just like pictures when I go through like my gallery of photos I took from Gundam the Origin, where he will just do a series of panels like depicting a Char grin and just going into Char being evil for a moment. It's very delicious.
Yeah, there are lots of like really good subtle low angle shots of Char as he smirks, like with a very ominous background. Like it is, one of those things, and you get a lot of that in the OVA, right? Because the OVA replicates a lot of those shots in the anime, and you just, but it is something where I think the OVAs, while they're very good, they never quite capture, I think, like all the subtleties of like it's of course they couldn't, like it's animation, so it's like it's just a different thing, but the subtleties of the facial expressions on the characters, particularly for Char, who's like a character who has subtle facial expressions. Obviously, characters like Bright and Amuro and Fraubo are much more expressive because they're like, incredibly stressed and super high stress, very emotional scenarios. So when those moments where it's very appropriate, Yoshikazu Yasuhiko does go for a much more explosive art style that's very expressionistic, and where characters are distorted physically to sort of get their emotion across. But Char is never drawn that way, because that's not the guy he is. He's always super cool, super constrained, super confined, until we'll talk about like the ending where he plays with that a little bit more, and kind of distorts Char some in the last sequence of the manga. But in general, Char is this kind of contrast to all the white-based characters, where he's so confined to who he is, and just is like, that's where you get all the subtleties of Yoshikazu Yasuhiko's art, because all he has to really play with is the fucking chin, and the camera angle, and the body posture. But everything about Char's characterization, as you say, all the stuff that like Shuichi Ikeda imbues the character with his voice, just comes across through the physicality of the character in wonderfully subtle ways. That is also one of the more impressive parts of the manga to me, is how restrictive it feels like that character design should be to the manga format, because of how covered up he is. But it like never, not only does it never negatively impact the way the character is like visually read on the page, and like getting access to some of like what's going on with that character, it enhances it because it's so a part of who he is.
He also makes it super queer when Garma's around. I just have to say that. I'm looking through these photos, and I do have the sequence where you have Char in the shower while Garma is in his room. And if you thought that scene felt a little queer in the TV show, it's a lot of juxtapositions of like Char's naked ass and abs, and Garma kind of looking at him, aside, and it's the good stuff.
Yeah, if you want Char butt, this is Char butt from the guy who designed Char, so he knows every inch of that butt better than anybody.
Oh my god. Yes, but it's very good. Anyway, absolutely. It's good stuff.
Yeah, so that's like, I feel like that side of the manga, right, where it is adapting the anime and like reproducing these elements in moments from the series Exactly. There's one line I wanted to pull up just because I think it's funny in Japanese. Like I said, in general, if it's a scene from the anime, it is just going to be word for word the exact dialogue that scene has in the anime. There is early on one exception that made me smirk because it's just like a weird thing that happened because of the way the continuity's been slightly shifted. Is there's a very, very famous off-quoted Char line from I think it's episode 2 in the original show, which is him saying "Misete moraou ka, kono renpou-gun no mobile suits no seino to yaro," which is basically is like, let's see the performance of this so-called Federation mobile suit. But Yasuhiko has to make the slightest adjustment to that line because in this universe, the Federation already has mobile suits. It's just all their mobile suits are shitty. So he has to call it Mobile Suits no Shin no Mobile Suits no Sei no Teyaro. So it's like, it's the new Federation mobile suits so-called performance. And it was like, it only jumped out at me when I was reading because it's like, I was so accustomed to word for word, like this very iconic, extremely memorable dialogue in Mobile Suit Gundam. Mobile Suit Gundam in Japanese has like the most fucking quotable dialogue. And then you just have to like, it felt like, I wonder if like the editor just said, I mean, you got it technically, this line doesn't actually make any sense in a universe where they already have fucking like gun tanks and gun cannons and stuff. So you just, I know it kind of hurts the pacing of the line, but you just got to put the character Sheen for new in there because it just doesn't make any sense. And I feel like in my internal narrative how that moment happened, it's just Yasuhiko just very, very reluctantly going, fine, okay, Sheen, mobile suits, fucking whatever.
Sheen is a good word. I like the word Sheen. Yes. It's got a cool kanji. It makes sense.
Yes. But yes, so that's that stuff in the manga. But let's talk about some of the other side of the manga where it makes, like, in some places, very significant alterations throughout. And then the deeper it goes in, the more substantial, like, not just alterations, but, like, big additions and things that, like, were in the anime version are added in. Obviously, the flashback stuff is the biggest part of that, but that then affects a lot of things that happen afterwards. So what are some of the things that they changed, Jonathan, that you want to talk about?
Well, I think broadly there's actually two halves of this we can talk about. There is the first stretch of the manga up to them basically getting to Jaburo, and then there is the flashback, and then there's everything after that. And when I say up to Jaburo, you might think that's later in the series than I mean if you've only seen the anime, because this is in the early going, structurally, this is the biggest change he makes, and I actually think this is a good change. I think, like, the movies would have been better if they were able to do this in movie 2. He moves Jaburo up before Odessa Day. Part of this is because the geography of Earth makes that make more sense with where Jaburo is. Odessa, wherever that is in the show, is sort of nondescript, but he makes it literally Odessa in, like, the Soviet Union area, where like the Odessa steppes from, like, Battleship Potemkin. They're like, the Gyan is on the Odessa steppes that you would have seen in the movie Battleship Potemkin, which is one of the most famous movie scenes of all time. Anyway, so, like, it would make less sense in his, like, very geographically descript version of this to have them go over to Russia, then back to Jaburo. So instead he keeps the first, like, it's 4 volumes in this version, I guess 8 in the Tankobon, is them heading basically down the west coast of the United States into, like, through Mexico and then into South America down to Jaburo, and that is the first stage of the mission. Then there's the flashback, then it's them going over the sea, we get Dublin, over to Odessa, and then Odessa Day becomes, they rearrange some things so that Odessa Day isn't just a big campaign, it's the campaign to get the Zeons off of Earth. There's a lot of, like, little, like, kind of finicky military strategy changes like that just sort of, like, smooth out some of the storytelling that is kind of fun to see if you care about the strategy and, like, geography side of things. And so after Odessa Day, then they go back into space. And in terms of large structure, there's fewer changes in the space section, but there are additions and things to talk about. But that is one of the big interesting things. There's also stuff like coming home is again in a different place than it is in the show. It's moved a little earlier in the movies. It's moved even earlier here. I still prefer where it is in the show. But there's all that kind of stuff. I don't really
understand the coming home movement because it comes before them defeating Garma in the manga version, which just, like, it just doesn't make sense to me because it feels like Amuro's entire character point there is that at this point he has become ingrained enough in, like, the military structure of the White Base that he can't escape it. even if he wanted to, and it's kind of unclear whether or not he wants to say that he's conflicted on that point. But it feels weird for that to happen before they have their first major victory, where it always kind of felt like the point of that sequence in the show partially was that after accomplishing this, like, big thing, Amuro is now, like, stuck. He's been in it for too long, and he's done this, like, you know, he doesn't realize that basically Char has orchestrated the whole thing, but from their perspective, they fucking defeated one of the fucking Zabis. Like, that's a huge feather in their, like, military cap, and Amuro is now stuck where he is, and I never really understood the choice to move that piece earlier.
No, like, in the movie, I don't think it matters as much, because the movie just moves it before, like, the big funeral and their first fight with Ramba, but it's still after killing Garma, and so broadly it still works. Like, the story still works. It's like, it's a very well done version of Coming Home. I like that. There's another change he makes in the Coming Home section is, instead, in the show, he comes out in the Gundam. In the movie, it's all in the Core Fighter, and in this, it's done as sort of a big car chase sequence, which is a kind of fun way to do some variety in there. And it involves Sayla and some other stuff. But yeah, I think that's one of the only... There's that. There's also, he does like there's something later in the manga with sort of decoupling the two cosmic glows that I don't like, that are some movements that happen. But yeah, that's one movement. But broadly, this sort of, the way he's restructured some of the plot from OG Gundam in this, like, sort of more geographically oriented version of the story, which matters to me not just on a pedantic, like, where are they in the world thing. That's not what I care about. It's more that I like that, in the way that, like, reading Lord of the Rings, if you know, like, the geography of Middle-earth, it's cool to see how they're moving across it. I like that there's a very clear logic to everywhere they go, and it feels like there's a lot of forward momentum in the journey because of that. And Yasuhiko just has a fucking field day with various, like, you know, real world markers. Like, in the entire Garma section happens in Hollywood, like literal Hollywood Hills. Like, Garma has set up in like a Beverly Hills mansion, and it is very funny and it is very interesting, and I think works for that story very well. There's like a little change, like the Eskenbach family is basically like local gangsters in this version almost. And I think that stuff is cool. So there's a lot of little tweaks like that. And then broadly, I do think the change to do Jaburo and then move on to Odessa Day as the end of the Earth section works very well for me. And definitely, I love what he does with Odessa Day in general. And I think I could see in my head a version where they were able to reanimate more of Movie 2, and Movie 2 climaxed this way. That is a better version of Movie 2 that wouldn't have that weird split in Movie 2 where it kind of feels like two movies and it doesn't do the Odessa stuff at all.
Yeah, because I think, like, it's a smart adaptational choice, because it's not something where necessarily I think it's superior to what the TV show does, but it's something that's, like, it's one of the things that the manga, while it can replicate, like, individual scenes and sequences perfectly faithfully, and it's, like, utterly uncanny, the manga isn't an episodic TV show, right? So it's like, it can't do some of that stuff. And I do think there's stuff that the manga struggles with in places with characterization, because it's not an episodic TV show, and it doesn't, like, replace the kinds of, like, normal episodic interactions that Amuro has with the other members of the crew. So I do feel like I wish that there was something in the manga that replaced, like, you know, every single episode Amuro would have a conversation with Sayla, and every single episode he would have a conversation with Ryu, because it's like, it's an episodic TV show. Every episode he gets in the Gundam, he has a fight, and there's, like, a procedure there. And the original TV show uses that to create natural kind of, like, colleague type relationships between Amuro and the rest of the crew, that then is one of the core dynamics that things like Ryu's death operates off of. And those things are broadly missing in the manga, which is one of the places where I wish the manga, like, created more sequences or went a little bit further afield to kind of find other ways to fill some of the character gaps that exist, because I feel like the relationships between the crew members sometimes feel a lot thinner in the manga.
This is the ultimate advantage the TV show has always had, is in that, and then I think in the general sense of, like, Amuro's power growing has always felt the most natural to me in the TV show because of the episodic structure. I think a lot of people go back and view them as limitations, like, he has to go out in the Gundam every time. And I'm like, well, it's a TV show, and it was conceived as a TV show, and it was made as a TV show, and it used the format incredibly effectively. And the manga uses its format incredibly effectively. So for what's lost, I think other things are gained. But it is one area where that is something I would agree with you, that the anime just has a leg up, that the manga could replace some of that stuff, but it's also just, some of it is just TV versus comic, you know?
Yeah, because one of the things that the manga does is by reordering that structure, it is able to create a like overall narrative like sense of itself that makes way more sense for this more kind of seamless story that's told in manga
Yes.
versus like the more choppy nature of episodic TV show where it's like for Mobile Suit Gundam the anime, like it frankly doesn't matter whether or not it makes perfect geographic sense where they are, and the TV show doesn't take place literally exactly in our geographic world. It is a sort of like this isn't America, it's Ameria, it's that kind of thing.
Right.
So it's like it's a slightly different design in that sense. But for the more seamless nature of the manga, I think it was very important to sort of take that stuff into account. And the other thing that I think that it does is it creates like two clear phases of the story that fit much nicer, that then have the flashback in the middle that breaks it up, which is there's like the Federation on the defensive, the flashback, the Federation on the offensive. And
it's
like
such a cool move.
Yeah, it's a very clear structure that the TV show doesn't need, because it's episodic, so it's like it has all these breaks anyways, so it doesn't need those like movements to fit that kind of military pattern. But for the manga and it being more seamless, I do think it was like important to consider that, and to make those shifts. And in general, like I think that those choices and where those like bigger ideas get moved around, like that is a very smart adaptational choice that works the medium that it's being moved to.
Yeah. Like, I can imagine a movie trilogy. Some people ask us sometimes, and we should actually fully address this question on this episode, Sean, because we get asked it enough. Do we want Sunrise to do some version of a remake of Original Gundam? We can talk about that later. Mm-hmm. If they were ever to do, like, the adaptation of the Origin, I actually think the best way to do it would be a new movie trilogy, where you could make a really good movie too, where the midpoint action sequence is the Jaburo attack, because that's how phase 1 of the manga ends, is with the big attack on Jaburo that is, again, a little more fully fleshed out. Like, Char has a bigger role in that, and there's this, doofus admiral who kind of fucks it all up on the Zeon side, and it's where you sort of see all of the Zeon's weaknesses. And it is the final time the Federation is fully on the defensive. And then there is the flashback, and then it is, we're going to turn the tables, and they start turning the tables, first with Odessa Day, then with Solomon, then with Abawaku, all of that stuff. And I could see a really good movie, too, where your sort of midpoint is the Jaburo stuff, and then your big, second and third act would be moving over to Odessa and having a big like war scene in Odessa Day, which is very epic and finishes the Earth section.
Yeah, I agree with you that like were you to do this, that it makes the most sense as a movie thing, because as you say, like I absolutely think that if movie 2 could have done this, obviously it was restricted by the nature of it being largely using pre-existing footage from the show, but that flipping like makes the movement in a like seamless narrative sense much more effective, whereas in like a TV sense that doesn't matter as much, because there is like one thing that like this doesn't matter, but it's I guess it's just like a thing to point out, because because of the movement and the shift, like the entire reason why they go to Jaburo in the first place in the anime is because that's like the only place they can go to get into space, right? Like it's why Jaburo is at the equator line, is because that is like physically the easiest way to get into space, and that's why that's where all the space elevators and like launch pads are. And so for a TV show, that was like a good enough like momentum and a good enough reason to get there and do all that stuff. Whereas like if it was a manga, I think if that was like their only reason to get there, it would have been profoundly tedious, because it like the manga relies much more on the top level plot line to drive things rather than the like individual plots of individual episodes. And that's like kind of specifically what I mean by like for the TV show it doesn't particularly matter. For the manga, it's like that stuff is really important, and so those adaptational choices were really significant and smartly made.
Yeah, the engine of the TV show is what happens within the episode,
yes,
which builds in a serialized sense, but Tomino has always been an anime creator, and there's anime creators who are the opposite of this, who I think is more focused on the episode, and that's all the way through G-Reco. All of his shows have big serialized plots, but like the engine of every episode is the episode, and even in something as complicated as Zeta, I think that is generally still the case. And so for a manga, you can kind of do that on a chapter level, but it's a harder thing to do, and that's not really what you're looking for. So it is that top level thing. And so, the logic in Gundam the Origin is, White Base is on side 7. It's got all these rookies on it. We go down to Earth. The first thing we want to make a beeline for is the big base where all the military is, right?
Yes.
And so that makes sense, and it's through getting to Jaburo that they prove themselves, which is why Jaburo then sends them out to the front lines of Odessa. And again, if you're doing a story that is more focused on that top-level storytelling rather than the individual engines of individual episodes, this is an improvement on that level. I agree with you, Sean. I don't have necessarily a clear preference for one or the other because I think they work for their medium very well, each of them.
Yeah, and it does give an opportunity for the manga to add in some really fun stuff where there is more detail and more insight into a lot of like the behind closed doors politics of the world that all like checks very clearly with I think the sense of the world in the original TV show. It's just you never really saw it because the TV show is so focused on the white base perspective with occasional asides to mostly Char and then sometimes like Makave or whoever like the villain is like Rambaral for that section. Whereas in this whole stuff, particularly with Jaburo, you get way more info about like the politics of like the Federation and hiding in Jaburo and like the whole point of the base of it being hidden and the Zeon's multiple attempts to try to figure out where the base is. And then that leads to the whole section of Char like befriending this group of natives that live in the Amazon forest where Jaburo is and using that info to find where it is. And then that also ties into the stuff that we talked about in the OVA episode where in the past it shows that he worked on that construction site to build Jaburo base so that he generally has a sense of where it is. And all of that like behind the scenes little like fiddly bits, that's some of the stuff that was like very fun as a Gundam fan specifically getting to see that because it matches so closely with I think like what you kind of would expect from watching the TV show, that like the nature of the episodic elements of the TV show would make those asides like bloat those episodes and slow the pacing down, whereas for the manga there's like a very nice space for that more like kind of fully fleshed out, very lived in sense of the world that you are getting access to through the narrative lens of the manga.
Yes. I also think some of the stuff they're able to do with setting is very fun. We talked about Hollywood for Garma.
Yeah.
There's a whole series of things they move to sort of this area of Mexico that I think is very cool. Yasuhiko just has a very clear love for like the world and world locations and stuff like that he kind of wants to see and show off. You get some good stuff with the characters. Hayato gets to do some judo on a group of Fed soldiers in this Mexican town. That's a good chapter.
Yeah.
There's various little things like that, yeah. And again, I think, and Jaburo has always been roughly placed in South America, but I think it being a little more just clearly tangibly like this spot on the equator, and then thinking about stuff like there would be a native population there and all of this stuff, right? Is very interesting. I think one thing to talk about is that, and this is just going to be a very big topic, Char and Sayla are generally more prominent characters in the manga than they are in the anime. I don't know if Sayla, I don't know if I would say more prominent. She is differently prominent. Sayla
she is used in a different way in the manga overall than she is in the anime.
Yeah, she's a very prominent character in the anime, obviously. She's in every episode. She's more prominent in the anime than she is in the movies, because the movies cut out the, like, G parts that she pilots and stuff. So yeah, Sayla is a little different, but then Char, the manga basically does not do the thing where Char leaves for large periods of time. He is somewhere doing something. He's less prominent in places, but he is still, I would say, roughly raised to the level of the deuteragonist of the piece. Like, he and Amuro are sort of like, it is a protagonist-antagonist structure, and very sharply, because I might argue Yasuhiko has a darker vision of Char than Tomino does, in some ways.
Yeah, I think he definitely does.
Yeah. So that's something to talk about. But he is, if he's an antagonist who is also main character number 2 on the call sheet, And so there's stuff like he is there at the Battle of Solomon in an interesting way. It's actually one of my favorite little things the manga does. It's my favorite cover on any of the books is volume 8 of the perfect editions I have is this illustration, the red Zaku at Gibraltar, which is on their way to Odessa. There's this whole added plot beat that feels like it could have been an episode of the original show where a bunch of Fed soldiers are getting slaughtered, and it's a mystery, and Amuro goes out, and what has happened is Char is so obsessed with Amuro, because one of the other things the manga does is it generally makes the rivalry a little sharper and more to the surface, and he is so obsessed with Amuro, and he wants to fight him, so Char has just, like, set up at Gibraltar, and is just slaughtering just large numbers of mobile suits. And it's the illustration in particular I love is him with the heat axe up, and there's all these like mobile suits like with their hands extended, like please no. It looks like, an ancient drawing on a fucking museum or something. It's great. And so Amuro winds up coming out and fighting him, and this becomes the big like final fight for the Red Zaku, which does not really get a send-off in the original show. So here it gets a send-off where Amuro destroys the thing, and it redoubles Char's commitment to like try to be better, which they pay off in the duel in Texas. He actually does pretty clearly beat Amuro, and there's kind of more of a push and pull in some of what they do here. But that's an episode I actually think is a cool addition. So that's some of the stuff they do to add with Char.
Yeah, because it's also one of, I think, the reasons why Yasuhiko breaks up that structure is because it keeps Char more central for longer. Because while all the round stuff is happening, you've got Char's, like, there's asides to Char doing his politicking to get himself back into the good graces of the military, and you have some new scenes around that stuff. That's good. And then, obviously, he's very central, as he was in the show, on the attack on Jaburo. And then, as you say, he's got this whole like sort of additional section here. I also enjoy that bit, and I think it's like it fits the structure of the manga. And as you say, it creates a more clear, specific line between Amuro and Char that continues throughout the whole story, rather than having the sort of like break in the middle with the TV show. Which for the TV show, this is another thing where it's like, as an adaptational choice, it works, but it's not necessarily something that I wish the TV show had done, because I think it's important for the TV show to have a rotating cast of villains. Whereas for the manga, it's so much more focused on that like big picture story, that keeping, as you say, the kind of protagonist and then antagonist / deuteragonist stuff in the forefront is super important, especially when you're then going to spend like a quarter of your manga on a flashback focused on that character.
Oh, exactly. Like, I would not change this about the original series, but the original series, it's a more one-sided rivalry. Yeah. Char thinks about Amuro way more than Amuro thinks about Char in the original series, because Amuro has a lot of other shit to deal with, and like Char is a front-of-mind concern when he's there, but you do not get the sense generally that Amuro is like up at night worrying about Char, other than maybe those first couple episodes, right? Yeah. In the manga, because Char is front of mind, Yasuhiko also does alterations to Amuro where Amuro is thinking about Char more, and particularly after the duel at Texas where Char kicks his ass, Amuro becomes kind of obsessed with him too, and so it draws this sharper rivalry between them. Again, that is not something I think the original show should have done. I think the original show did it the right way, and it's a version of Amuro I like, but I think for the manga, it would feel too disconnected if you had a big, massive flashback about Char, and then the main character of the main series wasn't thinking about Char that much, right? Yeah. So that's one of those things that Yasuhiko is just, I think he's good at tracing the kind of lines of fallout of the changes he makes, and that's one of those that I think is done very well.
Yeah. Another kind of is involved in all of this stuff, and I think it's like an interesting change that there's stuff about it I like and there's stuff about it I don't like. But this does also mean that Slegger Law becomes a much more, like, central is maybe an exaggeration, but he becomes a present character for a much bigger stretch of the story. Yes. Because he's introduced in the same place he's introduced in the anime, in the sense that he's introduced at Jaburo. It's just Jaburo's moved much earlier. So Slegger Law is there as, like, and it's him and a couple of other pilots that are part of his, like, crew that are minor characters, that are there for, all of the stuff in Jaburo. They're there for, obviously they're technically part of the crew during like the flashback, so they're like in the back of your head while you're reading all the flashback stuff. Like once you get back to the present day, like Slegger Law and all those characters are there, and then they're there in all the additional stuff they've added. Like there's another fight with the Black Tri-Stars, there's the Battle of Gibraltar here with Char, then the Battle of Odessa, Slegger Law is there, and so he's there for that whole section, rather than in the anime Slegger Law is introduced and killed, I think, 3 episodes after he's put into the show. It's like 3 or 4. He's a very minor part of the show in the overall scheme of things. Whereas, like, he's a pretty... just in terms of, like, amount of time he is a part of the crew and is there, he's a much more significant character in the manga overall.
Well, what I would say is he's a main part of the crew. So in the original show, he's more of a guest star for a couple of episodes. But one of the other changes they make is Texas happens before Solomon in this. So because of that, he is also at Texas. So Slegger is there for all of the episodes between Gibraltar, Odessa, getting into space, the Side 6 stuff, Texas, and then he dies where he dies in the original version, which is Solomon, and all of that is there. I generally really liked the extra stuff with Slegger. I think fleshing him out as a character and having him around more, which mixes up some of the group dynamics of White Base, and I think makes the crew feel a little more alive and reactive, and changes up some of the dynamics that we would have had there in the show. I like all of that. I think it's fun. I think he's got an interesting role to play at Texas as one of the characters who's sort of out on recon, but he's ground level. He's not in a mobile suit fighting. Some of that is interesting. And it makes some of the stuff with him and Mirai and some of that feel less whiplashy, I think.
See, this is actually my problem. I think I don't understand why the Mirai stuff happens in this version of the story. Like, it kind of feels like it's a misread of the dynamics that are at play in the TV show version, where I think it's, like, really important that Mirai basically doesn't know anything about this dude. Like, the whole point of it is that he is this, like, meathead soldier that's been thrown into the crew. He's only been there for a fucking week or something. Mirai's barely interacted with him, and she sees him as this, like, she just sees him as a meathead soldier, and that's all he is, and he's this, like, sort of generic masculine man, and she can just use that as a way to sort of, like, deal with the kind of emotional stuff she's got going on, where she had her whole, like, kind of idea of a life with Cameron Bloom. That was this, like, thing in the back of her head that was always there, that when she confronts it is gone, but she can't be with Bright because of the dynamic of Bright being the captain. So she kind of uses Slegger Law as an outlet for that stuff in a way that's not entirely fair to him, and he identifies and like, that's where that conversation is, like, being like, you don't want to do this, like, this isn't a thing, like I'm not the person you think I am, you're not the person you think you are, and they, like, share the little kiss or whatever. I think, like, that whole dynamic and the way that that story plays out using Tomino's, like, very compressed juxtaposition focused storytelling, where a lot of that dynamic is, like, not really told to you, but you have to tease it out based on the compressed version of the story that's given to you. That, to me, just doesn't really... I don't understand why Mirai and Slegger have a relationship in this version, because all of that stuff is spaced out so much more.
I think that's convincing. I think you're right about that. Yeah. I think I didn't have that same visceral problem with it. But I see where you're coming from on that. I think one thing it did for me, so the scene where the series of events you just outlined is done in the manga, where Mirai goes down to him in the Battle of Solomon, and they have that, he's eaten the burger and all of that stuff. It's recreated pretty faithfully, as a lot of these scenes are. I did get just a very different read on it that felt much more sort of sorrowful, and like Slegger was more of a character in that moment, and some of that stuff that kind of worked for me. But I can buy your argument here, and I think there is probably an argument to be made that if Slegger is changed as much as he is, he deserves a different ending. Yeah. It's sort of the sense of, like, there is no denying Slegger is a very whiplashy character when he comes in Gundam the anime. He kind of throws people for a loop, but I think that's pretty clearly Tomino's intention. So if you want to make a version of the character who's less whiplashy, you can do that, but you probably can't do the same things with him, is probably a fair way of saying it.
Yeah, like that's like a very good example of the kind of thing I said, like, kind of near the top of the discussion, of that there's stuff in the manga that to me is just like, I don't understand why you're doing the story anymore, because you've changed enough of the context around it, both by having Slegger Law be a character for much longer. So, like, if you're going to build up, like, a romantic dynamic between him and Mirai, you need to start playing that off earlier, or it's whiplashy in a different way, because it's whiplashy in the anime because this character's come out of nowhere, and then he dies. And in the anime, it's also important to note that's not a thing that happens so quickly because the show got cut short. That was the original plan. Well, the show got cut short after that point. So it's like the character's designed to be this whiplashy thing. Whereas, like, if you're going to build that up, you should be doing it the way that, like, the Fraubo Hayato stuff is done. In both the anime and the manga, where there are, like, little moments and little scenes that you probably will miss if you don't know that there's going to be a dynamic between those characters. But if you do know, it is subtly built up in the background, and that's not really done between Mirai and Slegger in the manga, and it feels weird that you would replicate those sequences so faithfully but change the context around which they happen. I think most importantly, the biggest change is putting the duel in Texas in the middle there, so you don't have the immediate contrast of Mirai loses her relationship with Cameron and then she immediately goes to Slegger Law, and like that, I mean, that's like happens between 2 episodes in the anime, whereas there's like this whole other big narrative that occurs in the manga version that like sort of dilutes the nature of like kind of the character drama and psychology that's going on there. That I just feel like, while those Slegger Law scenes are super iconic in the anime, and so I get like the instinct for wanting to replicate them, like that's the kind of stuff that I wish Yoshikazu Yasuhiko went further afield and just kind of totally changed how that happened. And like whatever happens to Slegger Law, or if there's a Mirai relationship or if there isn't, that like those scenes would be totally different.
That's totally fair. I do just want to highlight the scene where Slegger eats his hamburger right before he dies, which is one of our favorite scenes because he's just an American guy, so he eats hamburgers, right? Yasuhiko, he goes to town on that hamburger. It is a very good series of drawings. Also, that scene in the mess hall area, there's a bunch of graffiti all over the place, and a lot of it is very funny. The chair Slegger is sitting on just says, "Lick my ass, Amuro," on it.
Right.
And then there's a pillar that just says, "Bright is gay!" exclamation point. Which is a very funny approximation of, I guess, an English way of making fun of someone. It's very weird.
Yes.
Yeah. It's I think that's, you see the "Bright is gay" graffiti a couple of times, and it's very funny.
Yes, it's very like there was someone who like spent like a summer in America or something who
yes,
because he could talk to and like advise that, because it's like well, you're not like super far away from getting your kind of rude graffiti, but it's just off enough that it's very weird but very charming.
Yeah, it's very like like it's someone who spent a summer in America is like, they just throw around the word gay as an epithet in a weird like childish way. I guess we'll do that for our military ship, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, all right, what else to talk about here?
Let's see. So there's Slegger Law. Like, what are some of the other like major changes that are made, or like additions to the story?
You know, there's a lot of just like whittling down and kind of focusing and stuff like that. I think with like the Zabis and things like that. You know, I think Dozle, there's some stuff that I think is an extension out of things in the flashback stretch that comes back to play in the second half of the series. Like, I made a note here that Dozle has an argument that you know, when he is at Solomon being abandoned, basically, that you know, he basically talks about how, you know, we could actually probably win this war if they supported me. And he's probably right. And like Yasuhiko very clearly draws a line around Solomon that like, it's more decisive than people think, because Kycilia and Gyan are focused on sniping at each other, not at actually winning the war, which would require defending Solomon. And so Solomon is this interesting moment where the white base encounters less resistance than it thought it would get, because Kycilia and Gyan are just fucking up left and right at this point. There's a lot of stuff that they're like is, I think, very seated in the flashback and is there in the original anime that is drawn out more.
Yeah, that is some of my favorite stuff in the last sort of third of the stories. Yeah, you come out of the flashback knowing a lot more about the Zabis and their sort of inner politics and the dynamics between the characters. And yeah, you get a lot of little bits like that throughout the whole section, with Solomon and then also Abaoku, and then in Texas and all of the stuff in space. You're given these little moments and beats with the different Zabi characters, seeing how like the dysfunctional nature of their relationships, and the way that, like, you know, for instance, this is where Kycilia very clearly is more manipulative and even more backstabby than she is in the anime. This is where like you get a lot of little moments where it becomes clear that when Degwin is killed, that she's using that more as a political thing rather than as a legit, like, she really loves her father, and it feels more it's a political sort of like wedge to use to justify her execution of Gyan. Like lots of little moments like that, where if you like some of the kind of fiddly inner politics of, you know, like historical dramas, or like, you know, Game of Thrones, I think, is like talked up a bit too much in that regard, but Game of Thrones does have elements like that that are quite good in like seasons like 2 and season 4. And like that kind of stuff is very juicy, and it's very satisfying to watch this whole, hornet's nest stab each other to death, and then Dozle standing there being like, God damn it. Like, what the fuck? Dozle's the one guy who understands, like, military strategy, that actually cares about the lives of the soldiers under his command. But at this point, he's, realizes that basically it's a lost cause, and it's interesting getting that, like, additional level of insight into the character that reads to me very much like it is the same take on the character of Dozle Zabi you get in the anime, but by seeing where he came from in his much more kind of naive past in that flashback, it heightens the kind of like weary nature of Dozle in the present day at the end of the military campaign, realizing almost certainly he's going to die trying to defend Solomon.
Yeah. Here's a little change that we talked a little bit about talking about the OVAs, but I think it's worth fully explicating here, which is Makuve.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, Makuve is much more focused in the manga in his role as, like, the guy on Earth, the head of the Earth invasion forces. And he, basically, the way Yasuhiko writes him out of the series is to have him kind of go down with the ship on Earth. And so he gets out in his Gyan at Odessa and basically self-destructs and sets off this sort of like final nuke. And he has this whole speech about, let them, when the name Makuve is recorded in history, let the Gyan be recorded beside it, is basically one of his final lines. And then, of course, he does get the line about the vase as well. But it's basically and some of this comes out of what we got in the flashback with him, that like, he is an Earthophile. He loves being on Earth. He thinks Earth is cool. And he ultimately decides he does not want to go back into space and keep fighting this shit. He is happy to just die on Earth. The result of that is that he does not appear at Texas, and the Gyan does not duel the Gundam, but the Gyan does still get an appearance.
Yeah, it's that thing of where the Gyan it makes sense both here in the movie. Like, their choice, it's a choice I agree with intellectually, but in my heart of hearts, it hurts so much to not have the Gyan fight the Gundam. And it's like, I get it.
Yes.
It's like, when you're not doing the episodic TV show thing, I think it is very hard to think of how do you get that to happen. But at the same time, it's like, the entire point of the Gyan's design is that it is a duelist Gundam. Like, it's the whole thing with it. It's like, not a duelist Gundam, but duelist mobile suit. It hurts not to get that. Even though I understand it, and it is the right choice. It's just it sucks because I want to see the Gundam and the Gyan fight.
I think the argument you could make is that he somehow should have fought the Gyan at Odessa. Like, the Gyan should have come out in a different format so that, like, there could have been a big battle there between the Gundam and the Gyan as kind of one of the climax points of the Odessa operation. I think that's where you would have to do it, because I do think if you take Makuve as a character seriously, the logic that he would just die on Earth rather than go back into space and then do random stuff for Char does make sense to me. Like, I do think it is a change for the manga that makes more sense, especially if you've done the flashback at this point, which they have, and explicated a little more of his character psychology. I think all of those are the right calls for this version of the story, but I too want the Gyan to go into battle because it is the glorious duelist mobile suit.
Yeah, it is like, and the only problem with having Makuve fight at the Battle of Odessa, because it is like, it's the only place you could have it happen, but I think it's the right choice not to do it, because it would just take too much focus away from the nukes, which is the whole point of Odessa, right? Like, symbolically having the nuclear weapons there and Amuro disarming them, like, is a really important part of that story, and it would feel like it would end up making the duel with the Gyan feel anticlimactic, or it would be too climactic and take away from the climax of the nuclear weapons and the threat of the nuclear weapons. So it's just like, I feel like as an adaptation, you're just sort of backed into a corner, whether you're the movie or you're the manga, and just not being able to do the true duel in Texas that we all want. And having the Gundam and the Gyan sword fight with cows running around at their feet and stuff like that. It's a moment that's too good to exist in anything other than the original TV show.
I think I agree. Lalah, all of the events with Lalah happen in the manga.
Yeah.
And they happen in roughly the same order. Some things are moved around a little bit. Certainly also regarding like the Texas stuff and whatnot, obviously. And then in the end, the way I've been saying this is the two cosmic glows are uncoupled. So in the episode A Cosmic Glow in the TV show, it is two cosmic lows that are referred to by that title. It is the Lalah dying, and then the big new type flash that she and Amuro have together as she dies, and then it is also the solar laser being fired and by Gyan, which kills Degwin and General Revel and half of the Federation fleet, right? And that is when Amuro runs in and says, "It's the light of hatred. We can't let it win." In this version, I forget what order they do it in, but they definitely decouple them. They do not happen juxtaposed. And in fact, the final confrontation with Lalah is moved to not a sort of random confrontation between Solomon and Abaoku, but at the start of the Battle of Abaoku is where Lalah's death happens. I like all of it, and I think it's done incredibly virtuosically in its drawing and everything. Like, every moment is done as well as you could imagine in manga form. I do think, like, in general, like, the reason those two events work as hard as they do is because of how they work together. So I don't love the decoupling of it. That is a change I probably would not make if I were doing this. It's still very tour de force in how it's depicted, I think.
Yeah, because I'm with you that this is another change I don't love. Although I think I do kind of see why it happens. I think it mostly happens because the focus of the manga, particularly at this point, is so much bigger. Right, it's made Sayla is a like more sort of center of focus character by this point because of the flashback. Yes. Char is obviously a character that you're spending even more time with his perspective. You've got Amuro, obviously, but then you also have all the politics. You've got Revel, you've got the Zabis, you've got a lot more plates are being spun very actively by the manga because of the much wider ranging story it's told, and that means that I do think that like. This is maybe even like a bigger topic of conversation than just this sequence, but like I do think Amuro's character gets a little bit lost in some of that stuff, and he is decoupled or like removed from the center of attention. Even though he's still clearly the protagonist, he is the main character of the story. He is not the like main character of an episodic TV show around which basically every episode must revolve in some way, because that's the structure of if you're going to tell a different story for 22 minutes every single week, like you have to have a very hard focus on a core, strong, clear protagonist character around which to build those stories. And so I think a consequence of that is that some of these kinds of moments, I think it's also very true of Yu's death in that sequence, where it's just like it doesn't hit nearly as hard because you're not given such a like grounded humanistic perspective through the sort of vessel of your protagonist's character, that you're processing all of those feelings and all of those emotions. And the Cosmic Glow is like the most distinct version of that, right? It's like the highest point of emotion and drama within the original show. It's like, you know, I mean, that specific sequence is probably the most remarkable sequence in the original TV show. And it's something that I think it's probably too much for the manga to be able to replicate what a lot of that stuff does, and also try to maintain all the other stuff that the manga is doing that the TV show doesn't have to worry about.
Well, this is where just trade-offs are inevitable, right?
Yeah.
So I agree that Amuro is de-emphasized a little bit. It's not even that like Amuro has fewer scenes or something. It's just that there's more around him, which is what you were saying there, right? And so Amuro's role is diluted a little bit. I 100% think the stronger version of Amuro's character arc is in the TV show for a couple of reasons. Part of it just being that Amuro is our POV in the TV show, and he is less our POV in the manga, because Yasuhiko is less interested in telling the grounded from, you know, inside Amuro's head version of this story, which, to be fair, was already told. So you might as well change it. Than something that is a little more in Yasuhiko's modern wheelhouse, which is sort of Gundam as a history almost. You know, this is a big story of the entire world, and we see so much of it, especially because of that flashback. We understand such a big, you know, slice of this world, and everything is contextualized so clearly. Amuro's role in that world is small in some ways, right? You know, he does not have the 360-degree vision that we have, or characters like Char kind of have. And so he does get de-emphasized a little bit. The upside of that, though, is that a lot of this stuff of like seeing the world in all of that, and some of the extra stuff they do with Char and Sayla, I really like in the manga, and I really like it as an alternate version, and I really like seeing some of the lore fleshed out upon, and it creates opportunities for really cool scenes. You know, I think Char comes to a point as a character in a really, really interesting way in the manga for me. But yeah, it's trade-offs. This is an area where I think the manga sacrifices some things I love from the show to do some things that the show couldn't do. And that's kind of inevitable in this kind of adaptation. And I think the question is, did Yasuhiko make the kinds of trade-offs that result in a interesting manga? And I think the answer is yes, consistently.
Yeah, but like the one thing that I do think probably should have been done, though, is that once you start having that happening, it is where I feel like it doesn't necessarily make sense to do the like shot for shot, word for word recreations of scenes from the anime.
Yeah.
Right? Because that's very much like Ryu's death is probably even like a more specific version of that for me than the Cosmic Glow stuff, because at that point there isn't that much more stuff going on. But like, because you don't have the like clear episodic focus of spending time with these characters and everything, like Amuro only has one or two conversations with Ryu before his death, like with the main one being the one he has in the anime when he's in his jail cell and Ryu comes to talk to him, right? But other than that, Amuro and Ryu very rarely interact. And kind of the whole narrative point of Ryu's death, of him sort of sacrificing himself and that sacrifice being the glue that brings the rest of the white base crew together, doesn't really exist in the way that the sequence happens in the manga, partially because his relationships with other characters in the show it's less his relationship with Amuro and his relationship with Bright, and it's way more his relationship with Kai and Hayato, which that gets emphasized way more because that's the sphere of the crew that he interacts with in the manga, and he doesn't really go far afield from that. And so the whole point of that sequence in the anime is that he is the go-between between Amuro and Bright, and he sees both of their perspectives, desperately tries to get them to reconcile their differences, can't do it through words, but through his sacrifice shows them the path forward. And like, that dynamic doesn't really exist in the way it happens in the manga because of other changes made, but the scene is still done identically. And so it's like, when the context around the scene has been changed substantially enough, the identical execution of that like translation that we've talked about that is very masterful, a lot of the impact of that, I think, like, is lessened because the moment isn't a moment that exists on its own. It is built through the context of everything around it. And so it feels like I wish that Yoshikazu Yasuhiko adjusted those moments more to fit the new context that they had been given.
I think that's fair. I think the Ryu one, I definitely agree with. That I will say, I'm looking through the Lalah panels right now. I do think the way they do Lalah's death in the manga is fucking virtuosic and amazing.
Oh yeah,
like,
no,
it's
like
fucking
like
incredible.
The individual execution of the scenes is always very impressive.
Yeah.
I think it's like, it's the balancing act that's being made as an adaptation that, like, in a larger picture, it like creates gaps, I think, experientially for the reader of the material.
Let's talk about Char. A character we have not ever talked enough about. You know, I feel like just we always give him the short shrift. No, there's a lot to talk about with Char. I want to start on the comment I made earlier, though, Sean, that I think Yasuhiko's vision of Char is much darker. I think he, because Tomino obviously wrote Char for this and for Zeta and for, Char's counterattack and stuff, and I think generally we would probably agree that I think Tomino has this kind of, like, vision of Char as kind of a noble, failed hero in some ways, I think, is one way to say it. Like,
yeah, it always feels like Char could be a really good person, right?
Yes.
Like, and he's always like one step away from that. And it's the thing that, like, you're always kind of really rooting for Char in a way. And in the Mobile Suit Gundam, like, I mean, he's the one who ends that fucking war, like, and he still does that in the manga, but again, this is where, like, a lot of the context changes. And then in Zeta Gundam, he's a good guy. He's on your team. He makes the speech at the car, all that stuff. And then that leads into Char's counterattack, where I think the audience is meant to be very conflicted on whose side are you taking here, because both sides, Char's perspective and Amuro's perspective, both have, like, positive elements and negative elements. And you're kind of, I think, torn between who of these two characters do you really want to side with. And that is very much, I think, Tomino's vision for the characters is very flawed man who is always on the edge between being a monster and being a hero.
I think that's absolutely the way to say it. And he, I think he also is very invested in the idea that Char is someone with a certain amount of damage that holds him back from actually ever fully embracing that, right? Uh-huh. And I think that, and I don't think Yasuhiko's conception is, like, counter to that, but I think Yasuhiko is more interested as you inevitably are if you've done a story with a 6-volume flashback, in the damage part of it, right? Like,
Yeah.
I think Yasuhiko has a very clear investment in the idea that Char is someone who builds a lot of ephemera and nobility and regalia and an entire persona and an entire way of speaking around the fact that he is fundamentally a small, scared child who is scared of ever being scared again, right? Like, we talked about this in the OVA, that the primal moment of Char being attacked by the dude, the knight in the big suit of armor who almost kills him and Sayla, and against whom he is virtually powerless, and that combined with what happened to his mother, with the powerlessness of watching the Zabis take over his father's empire, all of this stuff, that is what leads Char to build a fucking, iron suit around his heart and his body, right? And that is what creates Char Aznable and leads to, him challenging God, right? And I think that is, and this is where I feel like if you've only seen the OVA, it's really cool to see the whole manga, to see how Yasuhiko takes those interpretations from the flashback through to the end of Original Gundam, because I do think it informs a lot of what happens with Char down the home stretch, which is that Yasuhiko pretty consistently emphasizes the darker parts of Char's personality that hold him back from being anything more than kind of just a fucking murderer, which is what he is in Original Gundam. Like, I don't think Yasuhiko is, like, wrong or morally off about, like, what Char... Like, if anything, there's a clear-eyedness to, like, Char's a fucking killer and, like, not much better than that in this story. And so I also think he picks up on something that has always been part of my interpretation of Char, which is that Char is not a new type. He might have some abilities in that direction, but he is too closed off, and he is too on his own to ever embrace that. And crucially, he is insecure about it. That is something they really bring to the fore in the manga. There's an entire scene that is... It's kind of there in the anime, but it's very fleshed out, where Char and Lalah get Amuro off on his own before the battle of... I think it's after or before the Battle of Solomon. It's somewhere in there. And he's like, it's like the Darth Vader, like, come to me, joy in my side, yeah. Amuro, right? And Amuro rejects him, and Amuro calls him out basically on manipulating Lalah, and also calls him out on not being a new type, and it leads to one of my favorite panels in the entire fucking manga of Char just with, like, his shit-eating grin broken on his face, where he's, like, stunned that someone has called him out like this. And he starts going on this whole speech about, like, what a noble person he is, that Amuro is nothing, he's as, Char is, like, the king of Zeon and all this stuff. And so Char has just a lot more fragile ego there. And, of course, this all leads into how Yasuhiko imagines their final confrontation, which fills all of the same basic, like, plot, like, checks all the same boxes, but develops in a very different way that puts Char in a much more fundamentally dark light.
Yeah, I mean, Char is, like, rendered monstrous in the climax, right? I mean, it is a thing where that sequence is redone as basically like a horror sequence, where Amuro is hiding from Char in this, like, medieval armory.
It's actually a really cool detail I like that they add, because they're in an armory in the anime, but we don't know how they got there or what it is. Yeah. In this, it's Girin's chambers on Abawaku are a big armory, and we see it several times, because Char even has a conversation with Girin that's really cool. Yeah. And then it's Char leads him into that armory, and that's where the climax happens.
Yeah, and so Amuro is basically, like, totally powerless against Char. And it which is the thing that, like, there is this dynamic in the anime of that, Char is more physically capable. He's older, he's trained as a soldier. Amuro is, like, a nerdy boy who spent most of his life in his underwear, in his room, like, hacking shit on a computer and eating chocolate bars and, like, fucking instant ramen and shit like that. So it's, like, obviously, in a physical sense, Char is much more capable. Amuro's, like, the amazing things about Amuro are mostly in his head, and not things that he can enact on the world with a physical body. He needs the tool of the Gundam to help him do it. And so that is, like, really heightened in how it's rendered in the manga. And then this is also where, like, the art becomes very, like, distorted, and this is where Char becomes monstrous. He, like, his proportions are shifted. He is, like, there's a great panel that's, like, basically a full page spread of him, like, kind of stomping through and shouting, and the way he is drawn is he's, like, he's larger than he could possibly be, even given like accounting for perspective. Like he is kind of swallowing everything in the room. It gets very like surreal because there's like a dream like element to it, because he has the flashback to the armored knight who attacked him as a child when Amuro pushes over a suit of armor. So all of those elements, to say, like, it drives it into a much darker place where Char is rendered more explicitly as a full-on villainous monster, and less of the sort of like troubled character who has been driven to this point through like his specific animosity and rivalry with Amuro and his lost sight of the larger objective. Like, some of that stuff of the larger objective still happens. He still shoots Kycilia in the head, but the context of it feels very different because of the tone of these scenes.
Yeah, and I mean, one of the biggest changes we haven't mentioned is he brings up the line from Char's counterattack.
Yes.
He has Char yell the line about Lalah was to be a mother to me, something to that effect. I imagine is it just the line in Japanese from Char's counterattack?
I'm pretty sure it is.
Yeah. But he just is. But it's different because he is like screaming this at him, like, you took her from me. This is what I had. This is what I wanted. And Yasuhiko directly draws the connection to his mom, and he says, "My mother, Astrea Daikun, was murdered by the Zabi. She was shut away in an old tower all alone, left to suffer in her sickness. I swore to avenge her. Not a single day has passed, even during this war, that I have not thought of my mother and her lonely death. And yet you ever stood in my way." And so Amuro becomes this like figure of projection on whom Char places all this hatred on basically his own failings and inadequacies, frankly, right? Like, that is sort of the strategy that is done here. And then the kicker to this is you do have their final like sword thrust, and you have Sayla come in. And when Sayla comes in and sort of gets in the way, this is where you have direct parallels drawn between the scene with the knight from the flashback and the OVA. And Char sees Sayla in the position he was in against Amuro. And Char has this moment of seeing that he is inflicting the horror on these people, including his sister, that was inflicted on him. This primal moment all comes together. And then you get the final sequence between Char and Sayla here, which is just much sadder than I think it is in the show. Because it is this fundamental, he has completely denigrated himself before Sayla's eyes. He sees hatred in her that he did not want to be there. He takes off the mask. Char literally says, "If not for this helmet, I'd be dead." He acknowledges that Amuro beat him, basically. And then kind of mournfully almost like says, like basically like, "Get out of here alive." I feel like there's kind of an implication that Char dies in this version, you could argue. Mm-hmm. But he says, like, "I have to go do this one last thing." He says, "Artesia, I've lived for this long for one reason and one reason only. If I abandon that, then all that I've done will have been done in vain. So be kind and nurse him and go on to be a woman to die for." And that is how he leaves. And then it's the same. He blows up Kycilia. Although the series of explosions that happen out of that is like fucking 10 pages of manga. Yes. And it's very epic. It kind of feels like when the fucking ring is destroyed in Lord of the Rings, it's like the entire empire comes crashing down. And there is a sort of mournful quality that it feels like Char has gone off to die. So broadly, that is the series of events. And I think it creates a darker version of the character whose redemption in this moment is a little less of a redemption than a sort of reawakening of a humanity that has been dormant and realizing how far gone he is and that there's no coming back for him.
Yeah. There's a lot of this that I really love. Like, particularly, like, all the art around this whole sequence is incredible. Yeah. I do think that there is too much Char dialogue in the last like third or so of the manga. I feel like and I get like the reasoning of that Char becomes much more vocal because this kind of facade starts breaking down, but I do think it became a bit much to me when he's just like literally connecting like all of the direct dots for the audience by saying, it's like, "It was my mother, and my mother was killed by the Zabis, and this, that, and the other thing," and like all the kind of stuff that I think is very apparent if you just read the manga. Like obviously, we've been thinking about this character a lot in other stuff in this as well. There's a nuanced differences to the interpretation of the character here. It's like broadly the same or very similar. But even without that familiarity, I think basically all that information has been communicated very clearly through like the plot and the characters' actions and things like that.
He doesn't need to say it.
Yeah, and there's too much of this, and there's a very similar scene that, again, like the art and a lot of the elements of the scene I love, but there's the scene from what is basically a really expanded version of the encounter that Char and Sayla have in the episode Char and Sayla from the TV show, where they encounter each other on Texas. And here that sequence is them on their old farm from, like, if you've seen the OVAs, it's that same place.
They're at the grave where everyone...
Yeah, they're at the grave at the farm with the farm in the background. There's like the big kind of like willow tree or whatever in the foreground. I love that Kai overhears their conversation. He's like sneaking around. And there's a lot of stuff in that conversation I love, and it's like Sayla starts calling Char out on his bullshit, but then it like goes and goes and goes and goes and goes and starts becoming so much about Char just sort of expositing his character motivations, and he gets very explicit about his like thinkings around new types and all that kind of stuff. And I think like I wish that stuff was dialed back, because it's like very excessive, and I think it's so much more effective to just let all the art and like the plotting speak for all that stuff, because it becomes a little almost hammy to me when the character is expositing that stuff so directly, because it doesn't read to me as like the character would be saying all of this. They'd be saying some of this, but it becomes more of just almost like an internal narration at some point in the way that it's written, but it's being like vocalized directly by Char to other characters. It's like he does that in that scene. He does that a lot in the scene, the kind of Darth Vader-y scene you pointed out with him and Amuro, and then he does that a lot in the last conversation that he has with Amuro during their fight. And it's like, if that could have been cut down by like, honestly, like 70%, I mean, it's so much, I think those sequences would be way more effective. And if you narrowed down the things that he's saying to the handful of like really important statements, that like you can kind of pin what's meaningful about what he's saying, and like cut it down to that stuff and have the action speak for the rest of it, I think it would be those would be better scenes overall, because so much about it is so good, but I found it very distracting because of how much dialogue, and that might be accentuated somewhat by it's harder for me to read the dialogue because I was reading it in Japanese, so it's like I end up having to focus on it more. But it's something that felt so unnecessary to me, and I really wish that those sequences were more underwritten than they are.
I totally see what you mean. It did not bother me to the degree it bothered you, but I think in general you're right. I will say the way they've redone the final sequence and the sword fight and all that, I found to be a real tour de force. I think it's very powerful. I think the Char just fucking losing it at this point and and the monster comes out, and I think like. And again, this is not exactly the interpretation we've gotten in other mediums, but I think it's very consistent with it. And I think it is good for Gundam to have a version that is a little more upfront with what a fucking monster Char is. You know? Like, this is kind of where Yasuhiko gets to have a lot of fun with Char being evil in the flashback. We talked a lot about it in the OVAs, right? But I think the flip side is I think Yasuhiko knows that if you're going to have that much dessert, you need your vegetables too. And your vegetables are Char kind of like being called on the monstrousness, you know? Yeah. And so I think it is powerful. I think the moment where, because this is, and I think this is key, the closest thing he has to an actual new type flash in the manga is the moment when he sees Amuro and Sayla in the position he and Sayla were in as kids, but he is the knight now. Yeah. And I think that's a really... And I think it's important that knight never had a face. We never knew who was in there. And Char has become that faceless knight. And he realizes that. He still stabs at Amuro. He stabs... And Amuro's wound is more violent in this version. It's like really in there. But the same thing happens where Amuro did get the better of him. And this is one moment where I do think... And I think if Char was less overwritten overall, it would stand out even more. But I think Char just literally saying, if not for this helmet, I'd be dead, and then tossing the helmet to Sayla. I think him acknowledging that is powerful in that moment, because that's how you know he's come down a little bit. For the first time, he's able to acknowledge Amuro's superiority in this way. And then I think there is this just... And I think it's important because this version of the story has his entire backstory, right? That you feel the weight of the sadness of what this person has become, and this entire journey was for what? It was for murder, it was for fun, it was for vengeance, but what it'd end up in is him stomping through a room trying to kill a kid, you know? And that's kind of what it is. And I think that beat is delivered very powerfully. You know, Char's last line in the manga is done with a full-page panel of him looking at Sayla saying, everything I did, if I don't finish this, it will have been done in vain. He's looking down at her. He's got this kind of like sorrowful expression. The blood is racing down from that scar on at the point of his third eye. And I just think it works really, really well for me. I think it's a very powerful version of the ending that I think in a version of the story where Char is elevated much more, it's a very powerful payoff to all the stuff that has been added for me.
Yeah, I generally agree just with if it cuts some of like that additional dialogue out, right? Because I think one of the things is moving the Lalah soon, like the end of Char's counterattack line of like she could have been like a mother to me. And moving that here, that line, the impact of that line feels so lessened when he then goes on to talk about for like 5 minutes, and this is my mother, and she was kidnapped by the Zabis, and this and that and that, and the other thing happened, where it's like, we know that. We've read the manga. Like, and Amuro has no idea anything about Char's mom, and I don't know why. Even if he's fucking losing it at this point, I don't think he'd be going off about, like, and here's my entire backstory about my mother, who you don't give a fuck about. Like, him just saying the Lalah Soon line and then having the actions around it speak all that, like, all of that emotional stuff to me would, like, land way harder. And rather than me, like, occasionally, honestly, like, rolling my eyes a little bit at how explicitly in your face he is narrating and expositing his, like, character motivations and the primary themes around the character to the audience effectively, is, like, if you just tone that stuff down, the rest of it is so good that, like, it would just be heightened so much more if those stronger elements were given more room to breathe.
No, I think that's totally fair. Again, it didn't bother me to the same degree, but I think what you're saying is right. And I think, like, you know, in my hypothetical movie version of this would be a fairly easy fix, because I think the plotting is very good. It is some of that writing that maybe is a little weaker. Sayla gets an expanded role here, where on Ao Baoku, one, she does get a custom GM she goes out in, and I like that Sayla has a Gundam. It's cool. It gets a color spread. It looks very good. And then on Ao Baoku, she meets a group of Zeon loyalists, like loyal to the actual Zeon Zoom Daikun, and she reveals herself as Artesia and sort of rallies them, and this is one of the ways that they're able to sort of win at Ao Baoku. And I think that whole thing is a really cool and, like, satisfying payoff, especially for, like, this expanded version of Sayla. It's the hero moment I always kind of wanted her to have.
Yeah, this is a change that I really like. It's obviously, it's one that, like, in the TV show certainly did not have the time for at this point, because the TV show had 7 of its episodes cut from it at this point. But yeah, for the manga, especially getting more focus on Sayla / Artesia, getting to have that full moment of her, like, reclaiming some elements of her past and using that for the present. Like, it's just a very nice, clean plot turn. Is like a really satisfying resolution for that character. That, like, all that stuff worked great. There's a really fantastic scene with Kycelia where she starts hearing about it, and she, like, realizes how much she fucked up by just being like, because she was like, oh, I knew that the other child of Zeonzum Daikun was on the White Base, like, her, you know, her, like, network of spies had figured all that out, but she had just sort of, like, ignored it, thinking that she's just a little girl, is nothing. And, like, that realization that, like, the real monster that she had ignored the entire time, the one that's, like, in many ways actually going to get her killed, is Sayla, because Sayla starting that rebellion is much more central to the Federation taking Ao Baoku, because in general it feels like Ao Baoku is a much more desperate fight on the part of the Federation than it felt like in the anime. Like, I think there's just more of a sense of, like, if the Federation lost here, it's totally over. Whereas I think in the anime, there's just such a sense of, like, the momentum has moved so strongly in the Federation's camp that, like, even with the loss of General Revel in the Solar Ray and all that stuff happening, that it feels like an inevitability that eventually the Federation will win. And more the drama you're caring about is Amuro and his fate and the emotional and personal stakes for him amidst this larger role, this war that he's a small part of. But I think for the manga, caring more about that bigger scale of the conflict and that stuff being a central focus, making it a much more desperate battle, and then Sayla's turn of guiding this revolt being a key thing that without it, likely the war would have been lost. I just think it's, like, a very smart, like, really, really genius kind of adaptational choice.
Oh, totally. Because yeah, I agree with you. They do make it a more desperate battle because they like, what's the name of the admiral or the captain that they first meet on Luna 2, and then he shows up a couple more times.
Oh my God. I know who you're talking about.
He's a bigger character in the manga, and he winds up as like the last admiral.
Admiral Joaquin. That's his name.
Yeah, Joaquin winds up as sort of like the last leader standing after the solar ray goes off. And so Joaquin and Bright wind up doing a lot sort of together to rally the troops because Bright like was making the push towards Abaoku. Solar ray goes off, and then he has this choice basically of like, do we finish it's kind of like if D-Day was the final battle somehow, right? And so they make this push and they sort of pull through, and everyone gets their big hero moments. But the final confrontation on Abaoku, they really make it a three-pronged thing of Amuro, Char, and Sayla as kind of all equally important. And Amuro gets some really good moments, not to be lost in the shuffle. He has a scene before he goes out for the final battle with what'll wind up being Char and the what's the suit he's in? The
Zeong.
The Zeong, yeah. Where Amuro he's got one of his like juice boxes or whatever they are. I know they're not. The space like drinks.
He's got his apple juice and his Lunchable.
Yeah, he's got his apple juice and he got his Capri Sun out of his pizza Lunchable that his mom bought him because it was a special occasion. Anyway, and he has a final conversation with Frau Bo. I really love this moment. He and Frau don't really get a denouement in the anime, and some of that's purposeful, but I think this scene manages to thread the needle between Amuro has matured as a person, but he's also left Frau Bo behind, because I think the scene acknowledges they're not going to get married and have kids and all this stuff, right? But they can still be friends, you know? He still cares for her. He's fighting in part because he doesn't want her to die, right? And I think it's a really lovely little scene, and at the end of it, you get an amazing hero moment where all the alarms start going off, and over the intercom it says like a mobile suit is closing in, and Amuro has a little flash and goes Char, and it's a big full page panel where he's holding Frau and he says Char is coming, and then he like kicks into action and he sends everyone away and he goes out into battle for like the final battle. It's very cool, and I like Amuro just getting to play the hero in that moment.
Yeah, no, that is a really great sequence. Yeah, there's just some good shots of like, you know, because the battle feels much more drawn out, because I mean it's basically one episode of the anime. You get a lot of more stuff of like Amuro coming back, and you see him like how like haggard he is because he's going out in multiple waves along with everyone else in fighting on the front lines. Yeah, like that scene is particularly nice.
Yeah. One other thing we haven't talked about that I really love is we talked about how you can kind of hear the music sometimes while reading this manga.
Yeah,
but you can literally hear it because at several major points, Yasuhiko just writes in the lyrics from the Daisuke and Noe songs used in the movie trilogy, including at the very end. The words that kind of end the manga are that song. Yes, my sweet, yes, my sweetest, I want to get back where you were, all that stuff, right?
Yes, which is very funny when when you're reading the Japanese version and all of a sudden all this English text pops up. It's like, what the fuck? What's happening?
Yeah.
Oh, right, the song.
It's fucking great. They do that there. They do it at the Battle of Solomon with Soldiers of Sorrow. They do it and then they do it also in the Cosmic Glow. You get the song there. I think that is a genius little move. I loved that, Sean.
Yes, no, as soon as I saw that, I'm like, I'm sure this was like Jonathan's favorite part of the entire manga.
It's so great.
Yeah, it's very good. It's like, I do particularly like, because at the very end, the page that's a full page spread of Amuro and like Amuro floating towards the White Base crew that are all on the little like lifeboat or whatever, reaching out to him, and you just have the words, yes, my sweet, yes, my sweetest, I want to get back where you are. And then reading in Japanese, then at the bottom of that in Japanese text, it says "Darimo hitori de wa ikirarenai," which means like nobody can live alone. And it's more or less in terms of our characters, it's the last moment of the manga. Although you then get some like kind of wide shots of everything else happening, and the narrative voice coming in and wrapping things up. But yes, I think that is because that is a great moment and a great idea, because it's not just using the lyrics as a gimmick. It's like he pairs the lyrics visually with moments that accentuate what the specific lyrics are talking about, such that it reads more like poetry commenting on that big moment, rather than just being like, oh, this is a very popular song that is in the Japanese popular consciousness so deeply associated with Gundam, because remember, the Gundam movies were the things that exploded really big, so they're like really closely associated with people's memories of first Gundam over there, far more so than it is for like the Western fan base of this series. So it makes sense to integrate it really like deeply into the art in those moments, and it's a cool idea.
Yeah. Again, yeah, that final page of everyone on the lifeboat reaching out for Amuro, Amuro reaching out for them flying through space, and it ends with the words, "No one can survive alone," juxtaposed against that. Doesn't get better than that. Come on. That's brilliant. That's a brilliant choice.
Yeah. It's some very, very, very good stuff.
What else to talk about from the manga here or elsewhere?
I think there's a lot of big stuff. There was a couple of other moments I wanted to point out. So one thing I think is interesting, and there's things I like about this, things that I think are kind of weird about how it's done. But Shalia Bull makes the cut.'s in here. That's like a thing that you would assume would get cut out of the manga adaptation, because there are lots of like other things that are great that would, know why they were cut for pacing stuff of you don't get Isolina's fate is cut out for the manga version. You don't get any of like the fun little episodes like Time Be Still isn't in here, but he did find a place to squeeze Shalia Bull in the duel in Texas. And I like that, but I'm very confused by the choice, and it is lampshaded in dialogue, so you're aware of it, of the idea of using the Brow Bro, not Frau Bo, the Brow Bro, which is the like kind of prototype of the Elmeth, the sort of prototypes of the kind of bit concept, where it's got the 4 like guns on each kind of like side of the ship that are connected to cables that shoot out, and so it's like it's like a bit or a funnel in Gundam, only it's physically connected to the mobile armor, to sort of get the idea that it's a prototype. But he uses it inside of a colony, which completely defeats the purpose of piloting the fucking Brow Bro. The entire idea of the omnidirectional attack of the Brow Bro is that it can get you from anywhere because you're in space. It's a big fucking like sphere-looking thing with 4 guns that can attack from any angle, except for if you're in a colony in which it very much can't attack from any angle because it's in a physical, like, it's constrained in this like canyon. And again, like, the dialogue specifically points this out, because I was watching being, like, befuddled by the use of the Brow Bro in this context. One of the characters says, it's like, oh, well, he can't, Shalia Bull can't use the Brow Bro to its, like, highest potential because he's inside the colony. It's like, well, why didn't you fucking attack them outside the colony then? What? Why did you wait here and do an ambush here? Why not ambush them in, like, the whole fucking debris area around the Texas colony, the thing that Makave did in the duel in Texas with his bombs and all that shit? It's very weird.
It is weird, but I was happy to see Shalia Bull there. Brow Bro is a great name for a mobile suit, so why not?
Yeah, and the glasses lady who is the original pilot of the Brow Bro in the anime, then there's, like, that one little, like, one-off fight where that idea is introduced. She is there. She's in the background.
Interesting.
I was looking for her. As soon as the Brow Bro popped up, I'm like, where's, like, Glasses Scientist Lady from the one episode of Gundam?
My favorite character, Glasses Scientist Lady. We all love Glasses Scientist Lady.
And who I like to believe is her cousin, which is the guy who is in the manga also, who tells Char that there's no reason to have legs in space. It's all just there for show, and the people up top just don't understand it. I like to think that they're related somehow.
Oh, Sean, they give that character a name, and he even gets another joke where he's like running off with extra prototypes. They're like, come on, man, you're gonna die. I assumed that was made just for you.
Yes, no, the getting a lot more with that dude. It makes up a little bit for the fact that they cut out a couple of my favorite little Amuro moments, like Amuro doesn't have his toolbox moment with Kai, yep. And then Amuro doesn't have what is probably my favorite Amuro scene in all of original Mobile Suit Gundam, which is, and it makes sense it gets cut. It got cut in the movies because you changed where new types get introduced. But the scene of the dude being like, oh, I heard you're a new type pilot, and Amuro doesn't know what that is yet. And so he's like, really? Everyone says I'm really old-fashioned. And it's maybe my favorite line of dialogue that Amuro has in the entire series. Unfortunately, an anime exclusive, an anime TV exclusive. Because again,
look,
like, this treats new type stuff the way like the movie does, where it's introduced kind of around the same point it is in the movie version.
Yeah. I mean, this is why you've got to watch all the Gundam, because
exactly.
The anime has all these things that are iconic and perfect, and the movies have, like, the Daisuke Inoue music and some of that really sweet animation. Uh-huh. But the manga is the only place you can see Yasuhiko's just unfiltered art for 12 volumes. It's good stuff. This is all the Gundam. More Gundam, please.
Yes.
That's the alternate name for this podcast. More Gundam, please.
Yes, give me all the Gundam, shoot it in my veins. That's the subtitle to that podcast.
Please, sir, may I have some more Gundams?
Yes.
All right. Is there anything else to talk about with the Origin?
I'm assuming that in the Perfect Editions they have the like bonus chapters or whatever at the end.
Yeah. It's all in volume 12.
Yeah, because those are interesting. Like I don't know how you felt about them. I only particularly liked and I really liked the one that's the kind of like college aged, like Professor Degwin and all that stuff in the birth of Sayla. Like that chapter is really interesting and very cool. The other two ones that are set after Mobile Suit Gundam are like weird comedies, and I didn't really understand a choice to make them like fully comic. Like one involves a ridiculous polo game between like ex-Zeon soldiers and Federation bodyguards for Sayla. And the other is a bunch of Zeon soldiers trying to assassinate Amuro as Hayato's trying to tell Amuro about, like, basically, like, Hayato's going to propose to Fraubo and wants Amuro's permission because Hayato has an inferiority complex about it. And it's like the idea of Kai visiting Sayla and having a conversation after Mobile Suit Gundam, and the idea of Amuro, Fraubo, and Hayato all like going out with the kids to an amusement park after Mobile Suit Gundam. Those ideas are great, but them being a vehicle for like very kind of standard manga gags, it felt very like a really weird choice to me.
Yeah, I'm looking up in here. It says where these were written for, because these weren't just like serialized alongside the manga. Mm-hmm. They were written for other sources. So yeah, the first chapter, the one where Sayla's birth, which I agree, that one's so good. I wish it was in the anime somewhere, like in the OVA. It's really, really good. But then you have the one that is about Sayla and the polo game. That first appeared in Official Guidebook 3 from 2011, and the second half was in the March 2012 issue of Gundam Ace, so it was just kind of a two-part extra thing he did. And then I'm looking for the third, and the first chapter was in another guidebook. The final chapter was a graphic novella that was produced for the final volume of the collector's edition. Okay. So it was made for that. Yeah. They're interesting. The Amuro chapter ends with this whole spiel from Amuro about how he's planning to go back to Side 7 because he wants to try to create a society for new types. Mm-hmm. So it's very clearly in a like non-Zeta continuity in some way. The polo one is fun in so much as you do get to see Sayla running around playing polo, and he has a lot of fun drawing her that way. She looks good in a polo outfit. But yeah, they are mostly comic, and the Sayla one disappointed me, honestly, because this did not seem consistent with the Sayla who announced herself as Artesia Som Daikun at the end of the manga. I feel like she would be a bigger political player in this world, you know?
Yeah, it's just weird. And I didn't know anything about where they appeared, because in the tankobons, it's just like, this is just volume 24. I think it calls itself like the special... See if I can scroll to the top of it and see what they officially call it in the Japanese version. But there's no context given at all.
Because I think they were first collected for the Isobon, and then they did an extra volume of the Tankobon to put the Isobon content out. And so in the Isobon, they're just the end of volume 12.
Yeah, so in the Tankobon releases, it's called volume 24, the like special edition, basically Tokubetsu Hen. So because all of the arcs are in the Tankobon, each arc is 2 volumes, and so they're all called like, this is the Odessa arc or Odessa Hen, and so where it has like the name of the arc, it just calls it special. So yeah, so there's nothing really to indicate that it's something like weird or different or comes from a different source. So like I knew that there were these chapters set after the story, and so I was like super excited to read them because I'm like, oh my god, that's gonna be so cool, because my favorite stuff in the manga is the flashback stuff, because that's where I feel like Yoshikazu Yasuhiko gets to run free reign, and we obviously didn't talk about it on this episode because we've been talking about it with the OVA stuff. But that's, to me, the most exciting stuff in the manga version. So I thought we were going to get a couple of extra chapters like that, but set after Mobile Suit Gundam. I was like, that's going to be great. And then all of a sudden it's like weird gags about like basically Gundam Team Rocket trying to assassinate Amuro, but they like fuck up in like exceedingly like dramatic and ridiculous fashion, all while Amuro is like, not even aware of it happening because he's concerned with what's going on with Hayato. It's like, it's very like 8-year-old gag manga material, and I was very bewildered by it. Yes,
it's weird. But overall, the Origin is great. the manga, the OVA, all of it. I think we've done justice to it. We have done 7 episodes on the Origin, manga and OVA. I think it's probably time to wrap this phase of Weekly Suit Gundam up.
The most weekly of all the phases of Weekly Suit Gundam. We didn't. It wasn't perfect. We have a little gap here right at the end that other stuff was going on, but it was nice to do a Weekly Suit Gundam for realsies.
What are we doing next? I don't think we've decided.
I mean, the next show, because there's not a lot of shows left. I mean, the next show is one I have not actually watched other than the first couple of episodes, would be Gundam Build Divers. We have
2 directions we could go next time. We could do Thunderbolt or Divers. People have been asking about this. I am still unsure of how we should cover Thunderbolt because it is a weird, unfinished anime and a manga that is still ongoing. I think we should do Divers next and hit Divers and Re-Rise because I would like to finish those before the 3rd-year anniversary. So whatever our next episode is, we're gonna have to have a little bit of a break because a lot is happening in the next couple weeks.
Yeah.
But sometime in April, hopefully we'll be back. And I don't know about you. Do you agree with my logic that maybe we just dive into Divers next? I didn't mean to do that pun, but
yeah, I think it's best to go into Divers and Re-Rise. And then eventually we can do an episode on, because there's like weird little bits. There's there's Thunderbolt. There's the Twilight Axis thing that's like very small. Like there's like we can do like a cleanup episode here or there for other stuff. But I do, I've because it started like finishing airing right around the time we started doing Weekly Suit Gundam. Like the Divers stuff is the whole for me in Gundam watching. Like it's the big Gundam TV show that I fucking haven't watched because I've been too busy rewatching all the old Gundam stuff for this podcast. So I'm very eager to actually watch like a brand, it's not brand new at this point. It's like several years old. But for me, a brand new TV show that's Mobile Suit Gundam, and for that I'm very excited.
Well, then that is your homework for next time, whenever that is, maybe in about a month. Episodes 1 through 26 of Gundam Build Divers. It's on Crunchyroll. It's easy to find. And it'll hopefully be a fun one. I've heard from many, many listeners telling us they didn't like Divers, but they loved Re-Rise. So I'm just telling you, I've heard you. Well. But I'm looking forward to both. I'm a sucker for this kind of thing. And we're almost kind of done with this thing. We're not going to end the podcast, but we're coming full circle.
Yeah, we're almost at the end of currently released and published animated Gundam material, which is weird, but yeah, next time we'll look at Gundam Build Divers. And when I watched it, I only watched the first couple of episodes, so I was a little confused that I have not yet gotten to the point where they actually dive, because presumably Gundam Build Divers is, of course, everyone's long-awaited Gundam anime about swimming. So I'm excited to see how they do that. 君は生き延びることができるか?